Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and we are live at 83weeks.com. And of course, we couldn't do it without the master of ceremonies, Mr. Eric Bischoff. Eric, what's going on, man? How are you?
Oh, I'm good. I want to correct you, though. You could do this without me. You just wouldn't get the level of vitriol and hate that you're probably getting, as a result of doing it, because, my takes are not very popular sometimes, but that's okay. I'm used to it.
Well, that's what we're here for. We're here for your takes, and we actually want to hear from you guys. We're going to be breaking down Ep.3 of the Mr. McMahon documentary. And boy, do we have a treat for you. Not only is there a lot of ground to cover in this episode, but we've got a first time guest here at 83weeks.com. But
A
it's a name you're
surprise, I might
familiar
add.
with.
We'd had no conversation about this. Like, what the hell, Conrad? I don't like, well, I do like surprises. That's the bad part.
Well, you're going to love this one. Ladies and gentlemen, I can't believe this is real. The one and only Wade Keller from the Pro Wrestling Torch. Wade, how are you, man?
I'm doing good. Although, Conrad, you didn't tell me Eric was going to be part of this either. I thought I was filling in.
Can you believe this is like a civil discourse that's happening right now, Eric? What's going on? You and Wade Keller and Conrad Thompson? Did I just say that out loud? What is happening at 83weeks.com, Eric?
Yeah, well, don't pop the cork yet because we just got started.
Yeah.
Well, let's have some fun. This episode 3 opens up with the whole Wendy Richter stuff. And I got to tell you, Wade, I was kind of surprised there was even a reference to this. I knew we had to talk about the Montreal screw job, but a lot of younger fans don't even know the Wendy Richter story. Were you surprised to see that included, Wade?
By the time they got to it, no. I mean, it felt like they were not shying away from covering everything, especially things relevant. And I think it's good for context to know that that's something that happened before.
I was a little surprised only because so much of this doc was things that we'd heard of and seen before. I mean, virtually all of my footage came from an interview I did about a completely different subject that had nothing to do with this project.
Oh, wow.
And there was a lot of that in there, or enough to matter. And since I hadn't seen anything that WWE had done on Wendy Richter, I was kind of like, I was pleasantly surprised, by the way, because I think Wendy doesn't get quite the credit she deserves. She was really kind of a transitional talent between the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, when I don't think that the audience really took women wrestling that serious. It was an attraction, and there were some performers that, definitely went out there and had great matches. But for the most part, it was, I don't want to say eye candy because that wasn't the case very often, but it was just an attraction. You'd see them every once in a while, like dwarfs and that type of thing. But Wendy performed at a much higher level. And she was there, not that she performed at a that much higher level, but she was there at that critical time when women really started becoming more important, I think, at least in terms of what I was watching at the time.
I thought it was interesting that they closed that conversation to sort of open the episode with Vince saying, it's not personal, it's just business, and there's nothing I wouldn't do for our business. That sort of sets the tone for the whole documentary a little bit, doesn't it, Wade?
Absolutely. I mean, he said, it's show business. I write the script. I gave you the belt. It's my decision when to take it off. It's my property. So, I mean, I think it was important for context that what happened with Bret wasn't the first time ever. And, every situation is different. And I mean, it should be judged on its own merits in terms of the context of it. And both situations, well, I think the Wendy Richter thing was probably a little simpler. Bret was a little more complex because there was just a longer relationship there. I mean, Wendy Richter getting a big push was when I first, right around the time I first started getting WWF television, maybe a little bit afterwards, in the Twin Cities area where Eric and I are both from. And, I assumed she was a big star, she was on the cover of the magazine. She got a big push. And she was, but she wasn't a huge success given the big spotlight she was given. I remember being at a WWF house show and Hulk Hogan, if I'm recalling correctly, wrestled right before intermission, which he often did. But I know for sure Wendy Richter closed out a show I was at, and it wasn't electric. I mean, there was little something about her as a main eventer that just wasn't quite where it needed to be. That said, I think it was smart to do, and I think it was actually something Vince McMahon deserves praise for. Obviously, everything he did because he thought it was good for business, not because he wanted to be woke. But I think pushing, the women's division in a different way, and treating women in a main event spot and the women's title in a main event spot was progressive, and I think helped, lay a bit of a foundation for what was to come later.
And Wade, when did you start writing The Torch?
1987.
So you started The Torch the same year I started working for Vern.
Yep.
And the first time I ever saw Wendy Richter was in Rochester, Minnesota, when we were producing the show for ESPN.
I drove down there all the time. Those are fun.
Yeah, and I think I interviewed her once or twice there. And that was my first exposure to her, really.
Yeah. And I mean, she was good. She just wasn't great. I think, today she would have a job and get TV time, but I don't think she'd just be like, oh, we got to push this person ahead of everybody else. But I mean, like I said, I think there was a lot of pressure for her because, I mean, she was being compared. She was the women's Hulk Hogan in terms of the push. I mean, she didn't get quite the Hogan push, but you know what I mean? She was put in a position as the women's world champion, and Vince was trying to see if he could turn her to a main eventer.
Wade, of course, the entire wrestling world was covering everything that was happening with the Vince McMahon trial. Were you in attendance for any of that?
Yeah, I was there longer than anyone. I was there from jury selection to closing arguments. I actually flew back in the middle, wrote a double issue of the newsletter, and then flew back. And so I was there for like 2 weeks and then another week.
So I can't wait to get your perspective of this, because we're going to talk about the pretty tense moment where Hogan is getting ready to take the stand. And Hogan describes it as, being very uncomfortable being in the same room as Vince. But it's almost positioned like Hulk was sort of crafty with the government and defended Vince. You were in the room. Did that feel like a big twist and a big bombshell based on expectations that the mainstream media had, that Hogan was going to be the star witness?
Yeah, this was accurate. I mean, I lived it in real time. Everybody thought Hogan was, Hogan's aligned with WCW. Vince McMahon is on the ropes. As the documentary said, Hogan's thinking, you want to align with the person or the company that maybe is going to be around and pay you a lot of money. And so for all kinds of reasons, the belief was Hogan was a government's witness. He was given immunity. They were confident he was going to say something that was going to, be very influential with the jury finding Vince McMahon guilty. And I was in that courtroom, and everybody, when Hogan started testifying, were kind of looking at each other like, is this what the government wanted him to say? And by the end, you could see the body language on the prosecutor, Sean O'Shea, and his assistant. They were looking at each other, and then they kind of, they didn't want to sell anything. I mean, if you watch real prosecutors, not TV prosecutors, they generally look bored. They just don't want to draw attention from the jury and the witnesses. But you could just, I watched them closely the whole time. I was always curious how they were reacting, and their body language sold shock and dismay. I think they knew their case got a lot harder. And I've talked to Hulk Hogan about this multiple times. I interviewed him, and he asked me in the middle of the interview, do you think I saved Vince McMahon from prison? And I don't know that he would have been found guilty either way, because it was a tough case. The government there were a lot of things Vince was guilty of, but the letter of the law may not have been one of them. And so I don't know, but Hogan kind of made it exponentially more difficult for the prosecution. And I also don't think Hogan lied. I think Hogan could have said things that would have made Vince look bad, but I think Hogan saying Vince never told me to take steroids was true. Was there an economic incentive? Did everyone look around and seeing the people getting the top spots had muscles, and the way to have those muscles with the schedule they had was to take steroids? Sure. But Vince didn't go around telling people, here's where you get them and you better take them. He might say, you look like you're not working out very hard. But that's a difference. There's a significant legal difference between those two things. And I think Hogan was completely accurate in his portrayal of it. And, I think Hogan thinks Vince should appreciate that, if not owe him for it. But what Hogan did, I think, was tell the truth.
I agree with you, Wade. And I've heard multiple times, I've heard, Hulk go into conversations when there's no one else around about that. And it's essentially what you described. And he was nervous. He
looked nervous.
He was scared to death, but he was sweating bullets.
Yep. Because he said he was worried they were going to go after him if he didn't do what they wanted him to. But that's why once he got immunity, he could be less nervous, but still walking past Vince after not seeing him for a while.
That's what made him the most nervous.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, that's such history.
Hey, Wade, you were there, and I'm sure you were watching Vince and probably Linda really close. Were there other talents there? Anybody representing Hulk from the locker room, or representing Vince from the locker room?
Not in an official way. Like in the audience.
I mean supportive, just hanging out.
No, it was just Vince and his family and his attorneys. No. I mean, I think it was either Offer or Sika was there and like mouthing to the jury sometimes not guilty. That was about it. But yeah, there weren't a lot, but obviously there was a lot of people testifying but they weren't in the audience watching. But you know,
How did the family react when Hulk gave his testimony? Were they visibly surprised?
good question. Honestly, I'd have to go back and read my coverage to realize that. I don't think I was in the audience and they were in the audience, but I suspect they were in the front row. So I just was looking at the back of their heads.
Sure.
So yeah, I honestly, I just don't have a recall of that. I probably wrote about it. It's in the back issues of the Person Torch newsletter. If I saw anything, I'm sure.
Where can we find those back issues, Wade? As long as we're talking about this shit, let's make some money while we're doing it.
pwtorch.com/govip. We have back issues dating back to the late 1980s. I was just rereading my coverage of something I think we're going to get to, which is a Bret Hart screw job. And I'm fascinated with my coverage of that. It's actually really fun to go back and listen. Conrad, can I give like a coupon? I'm going to make this up now, but can I give a coupon code so people can get in?
Yes.
All right. So Conrad 24. That's easy to remember. I'll remember that. I'll create a coupon. If people want to get in for get a whole month for $1. Is that too low? Should I do $2, Conrad? What do you think?
Hey, go for $1. Why not? It's the dollar menu with Wade Keller, by God.
All right. That's cheaper than I've done in a long time. But I mean, this is a new audience and I'm proud of my work and there's a lot of stuff there. So $1 for a month. pwtorch.com/govip. When you're on the sign up form for the regular VIP subscription, not the Patreon option, but the regular VIP, enter Conrad 24 and we'll knock enough off the price. You get the full month for $1. Thank you, Conrad.
Nice.
Appreciate the time to plug it.
Nice.
No, listen, it's great because I'll tell you, nobody had more in-depth coverage and just the breakdown of the steroid trial from someone who was there was worth it. But I actually became a full-time subscriber because of your coverage of the Montreal Screwjob, which you're right,
wow.
we're going to get to. I started subscribing in November of 1997, a subscription I maintain to this day. If you're not subscribed to the Torch, you're missing out. Go use that promo code Conrad24. How do you beat $1? Go check it out. See what you think.
And that's a ton of podcasts too that are compatible with Apple Podcasts too. Like it's new podcasts every day. We have 18 years ago flashbacks we put up almost every day. It's podcasts, it's ad-free access to our website, and then our archives, which we have year by year listing of all our cover stories I've written and editorials on all these big stories that I know you guys love talking about. It was such a fun time.
One more, I'm just going to say this, Wade,
Yeah.
and I mean this sincerely. I used to want to strangle you back in the day.
Yep.
There were.
It's hard to hear the truth
times, there were.
Sorry, you're complimenting me. I need to shut up.
We started asking if anybody knew your address. But I have also said on this show, and Conrad can attest to this many times, that your coverage over the last 5, 10, 15 years is really, I really appreciate it and respect the work you guys do over there.
Well, thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. It means a lot. I mean, obviously you're in a public position, and you make decisions that, I don't just report news, I editorialize on it. And I've said, been critical of things you've said and done, but I've also very, very, very much stood up for what a difference you made in the industry. The vision you had, the execution you had, the difficult waters you had to traverse at times with the people you dealt with. I still look back and I'm rewatching, the Monday Night War chapter and all this. And I just think about knowing you sort of before all this happened. And I don't know if proud is the word, but like I'm impressed, I watch what you were able to do and within the corporate system and the vision you had and to execute something that changed the course of the industry. And nobody should take that away from you no matter how they feel about you. That is absolutely just a fact.
Appreciate that. All right, let's wrap this show up. It's never going to get any better.
So I do want to ask, since you were there in the courtroom, I think most of us listening to this realize that a big part of the reason many of us are wrestling fans is Vince McMahon. But at the same time, we know that, there's been some less than awesome things, some bad behavior through the years. But you found yourself at the center of this when he's literally on trial for his life. And as you said, you felt like Hogan was being truthful. And I've wondered, of all the things they could have, because they certainly sort of painted with broad strokes in episode 2, what the government might have gone after Vince for, whether it was the rape charge with Rita or perhaps it was the Ring Boy scandal or any of those things, they decided to go after steroids. And it was positioned in the documentary by Vince McMahon almost like it was a witch hunt. And he said something along the lines of, "These bastards are coming to get me for no good reason." As someone who was covering the industry, Did you feel like this is, hey, they're trying to get Capone on tax evasion? Or did you think, no, there really is something to investigate here with regard to the steroid trial?
Yeah, no, I thought there was something to investigate. I mean, I definitely did. And I mean, like Linda McMahon said afterwards, oh, Vince was exonerated. It proved we didn't have a steroid problem. And Vince said in the press conference after the not guilty verdict, we've been exonerated. And it's like, exonerated has an actual definition, and that's not what happened in the trial. What it meant is the prosecutors brought a case that they couldn't prove. But the testimony was damning in that trial. I mean, I was there every day. I documented it in the back issues that people can read if they go VIP. I mean, day by day, meticulous notes of wrestlers going, oh, yeah, this was the atmosphere. This was the economic incentive. This is what was wink and nod, but not said overtly. You know, there was Rick Rude testimony that made Vince McMahon look bad. I mean, there were a lot of people under oath who had to say things that they worried was going to make them unemployable. You know, I mean, they were put in a tough position, but they were under oath. So the key is, and I'm not a lawyer, you know, that's not my area of expertise, but I mean, WWE had a system set up that they knew was happening where wrestlers could get steroids. They were capitalizing on those physiques. And there was an economic incentive clearly to have a certain look. Those are the people who got pushed. And then the just question was, you know, I mean, the stuff the government went after him for, it's like, well, there's this FedEx package that went here and it was a jurisdiction issue and it got thrown out. I mean, some of the charges were sort of flimsy compared to sort of the broad sense that something was wrong that they're guilty of. But a lot of the time it was when steroids were legal. It was Dr. Zahorian who was doing something illegal, not the wrestlers. So, I mean, it's a complicated, nuanced thing. I mean, it isn't something that I can even give a 2-minute soundbite on, but I didn't see it as a witch hunt, but I didn't see it as a super strong case from just the legal aspect.
Because I heard, and I apologize, I'm going to have to keep people's names out of this one, but several years ago, I was involved in a project that there was a fair amount of research being done on, and this is secondhand information now. I wasn't in the room. I didn't hear it word for word, but I think I had it conveyed to me pretty accurately. The FBI originally got interested, according to this story, in Vince because of the ring boy controversy. That made the feds go, hey, what's going on over here? And I think, if I interpreted the conversation correctly, the feds felt like they'd have a better chance of closing Vince down with the steroid approach versus the ring boy approach based on the evidence that was available to them. So it's kind of a little bit of both, if what I heard secondhand is true.
And I mean, sometimes, obviously, governments bring cases when they think they are going to get a conviction. They have a very high conviction rate. And I think they were very confident that what they charged would work. But they weren't going to bring a charge for the ring boys thing if they didn't have somebody that they could go after with witnesses and enough to prove it to a jury. But I don't think it's fair to say, well, because they couldn't get the ring boys thing, they manufactured a case they wouldn't have otherwise brought regarding steroids. Like living through it in real time, covering the indictment, listening to the testimony. It was just not a good situation that Vince McMahon should be proud of. And, you know, I mean, having a, you know, I mean, I think they talked themselves into thinking they're going to fly under the radar. They're pro wrestling. He's an assigned doctor from an athletic commission. We're just going to look the other way. But, you know, there were some slip ups, and I mean, it wasn't just a slam dunk. This is an absurd case. I think the jury, you know, had things to process when it came to the charges. The thing that I wasn't there for, and I wish I was, is the judge's instructions to the jury. So I had to get that secondhand. And that's one of the key moments in really any trial that's close, is the judge saying, you know, here's the law and here's what you should pay attention to. And here's things that are not relevant that you might think were wrong, but they're not illegal. And those instructions to the jury are very important. And I know watching the jury, the judge was a character, and they were hanging on his every word. He was a curmudgeon-y veteran who was moody, but authoritative. And so I think those instructions to the jury probably were as key as anything in terms of letting the jury know what to pay attention to. And it was pretty clear. Don't think because this guy is a bad guy who made money off of wrestlers taking a drug that you think is, you know, cheating or something, that he should go to prison. There's a law. Did he break it? If so, convict him.
Were you in the room for Rick Rude's testimony? I mean, I've always been under the impression that he was sort of saying that Vince, while he didn't explicitly say he needed to take steroids, he felt like he implied that he needed to take steroids when he said he needed to push himself. Um, do you think that? Did you view that as Rick Rude trying to sort of tattle on Vince? I mean, we know that ultimately Rick Rude did go back to work for Vince during the DX era, but a lot of fans wonder after he left after the Montreal Screwjob and did the whole I'm on a tape show and a live show deal. We've never seen Rick Rude go into the WWE Hall of Fame. And I wonder, are there breadcrumbs that maybe go back to that testimony? What do you make of that conspiracy theory, Wade?
Yeah, I mean, Jerry, in the Pro Wrestling newsletter, we talked about Rick Rude's testimony. This was years after the trial, and Jerry McDevitt, Vince McMahon's attorney, wrote us and disputed what were reported, and then I, emailed or called back, whatever, I think it was email, and just said, well, here's my notes on the trial, and here's the transcript. Rick said this. And then, it just kind of ended there. But yeah, that was something, I say that in the context of Vince is very sensitive, in particular about that conversation that Rick Rude recounted. And, there were implications if you want to have, I want to have the transcript in front of me because I want to be careful to be fair to everybody. But, there's an implication of if you want to be a dad and you want to be a wrestler, those things might not be compatible at this time because, taking steroids can affect sperm count. And Rude's testimony was damning for sure. I mean, I think it's probably the most damning of the testimony. And a lot of things came down to credibility. I think one of the turning points was Kevin Wackold's nails, who Eric Bischoff knows well from his days in the AWA's Kevin Kelly. And, he claimed Vince, pulled him into a trailer and said, you need to take steroids, and then made sexual advances. It was like outlet. But the ridiculous thing with him is he wore this loose orange prison outfit.
Right.
And Vince wouldn't have cared enough to make him the guy who he explicitly said take steroids, but Wackold wanted to do in Vince, in my opinion. So when Wackold said that, I think the jury said, "Oh, there are wrestlers who are going to say things to get to Vince. It is good. There's some wrestlers who are on a vendetta," and I think that hurt the credibility of other witnesses. That Wackold's was so over the top and lacked credibility.
Wow, that's a very cool perspective.
Yeah, and I think if I remember right, in reading over my testimony, because I did an interview, I think for ESPN's documentary on this a few years back, and I reread everything I did. And I believe they passed a photo around to the jurors of his outfit that a couple days later. And I remember on news reports, I was interviewed by the New York news stations that day. That every day they'd be like, what, they knew I covered this full time. And so all the TV and newspaper people just, we talked every day about stuff. And I was interviewed on camera and I said, yeah, this Kevin Wackold thing is ridiculous. I mean, Vince didn't care if he was on steroids. You couldn't tell anything about his physique. And that made the news. And who knows if jurors who weren't supposed to watch the news saw that. But the defense did, bring up later, this is someone who wore an orange jumpsuit. There's just no incentive for him to be on steroids. So, it's a fascinating thing, but the Wackold's thing, I think, helped offset some of the damage Rude did, because all of a sudden the jury's like, God, who can we believe is something, someone's going to say something that on the face of it doesn't really seem credible or at all.
Well, after the steroid trial is finished, we start talking about maybe the darker days for WWE business, specifically 1993, 1994, and 1995. This is where we see Vince and Bruce talk about how Lex was okay, but nowhere near Hulk Hogan. I think that's the exact quote from Vince. And then Bret even calls himself the guy who pulled the sword out of the stone. And Vince can't help but have a backhanded compliment to Bret. He said something like, Bret didn't have all that much charisma. He had enough. What did you make of the criticism that, Bruce and Vince both laid at the feet of Bret and Lex here, Wade?
Conrad, this is very unprofessional. I got distracted because somebody was trying to sign up for the coupon code in the chat room, and I wasn't even looking at that. So I'm so sorry. No, and the reason I say this is I have not added the coupon code yet. We're live. So
I got you.
So 10 minutes after the show, go sign up, everybody. But people are confused right now. So I'm embarrassed by that. So please restate your question. And I did want to get that out. And now I'll pay attention to you guys and not the chat.
No, I just wanted to get your 2 cents on Vince and Bruce, sort of implying that, Bret didn't have all that much charisma. He had enough. Lex wasn't nearly as exciting as Hulk Hogan. I mean, it feels just unnecessarily negative, the two talent right there, but maybe that's the way they really feel. What'd you make of the way they positioned Bret Hart here?
I think it was kind of accurate. I mean, I think Bret was charismatic, but not, a game changer. I don't think he was transformational. I think he's kind of the second tier of top tier guys. Lex got every advantage. I say, Eric, you probably agree with me on this. Like the stars who follow previous stars are rarely carbon copies of the previous star because they're seen as carbon copy derivatives. And Lex Luger was an attempt to copy Hulk Hogan. And I think, Ultimate Warrior is different enough from Hogan that had a better chance to work. But Lex was just Americana, American flag, long blonde hair, muscular, tall guy. And Lex wasn't Hulk. We saw that with imitation Razor and Diesel. I mean, it's hard to, just when someone is good and amazing as Hulk Hogan was in the charisma department, it didn't work. So I actually thought their framing of Bret and Lex was accurate. I mean, I don't think it should be a surprise to Bret that people don't think he was the most charismatic world champion in WWF history. But I mean, he was good, and I think he was an absolute right person for that time. WWE needed. I think, like I argue, John Cena was the right person at the time because it was coming off of Benoit and drug deaths and scandals and the Parents Television Council and all that. And Cena gave a friendly face to not just kids and families, but also corporations and advertisers. Even if the male fans booed him and didn't like him, I think he was the right person for the right time for them to grow to the point that they could have, these stadium shows with all these corporate sponsors and all that. So with Bret, he was the right guy because Bret, was so the opposite of Hulk Hogan. And I think it worked in his favor that he wasn't a guy who was out there with all this bombast and over-the-top charisma. He was a guy, and I watched him from the guy in the opening match at WWF house shows in the mid-'80s with, just hair that wasn't wet down yet, losing to then a really cool tag team with amazing matches with the British Bulldogs, team of Jim Neidhart. Then he worked from there to the Intercontinental title, and fans were with him on that whole journey, and they just respected the hell out of him. So I actually think it worked in his and WWF's favor that he wasn't something different than who he was. I think he was the right person for the right time, but I don't think you can ride that for 10 years. I mean, I understand Vince thinking I overpaid in a panic for him when times were tight and that money might be better spent elsewhere. I mean, I can understand that. I would want Bret on my roster, but at that time, I think he played the role the most valuable role he was going to have post kind of steroid trial.
We hear from
Yeah, I thought the
Hulk Hogan
comments. I mean, I do agree with you, Lex. Excuse me, I do agree with you, Wade, about Lex. And Lex, look, Lex is one of the guys. Ironically, after all these years, there's probably very few people that I've worked with that I have more respect for today than Lex Luger. But when he was at his peak of his career, he was, I mean, physically, he was beyond, comparison. He was at the top of his game. But there was just always that one. It was the it factor. He had everything but it. Mm-hmm. He was amazing until he tried to communicate to you. Not that he was very articulate, but it didn't have the magic. It didn't connect to the audience. And Bret was so great in so many ways. Technically in the ring, I think your take on being different than, and therefore not being compared to, absolutely right on the money. I'm sure that Vince felt comfortable that he wasn't going to have another PR nightmare with Bret because Bret's a pretty stable guy and not known for his extracurricular activities and all that. Yeah. So there was a lot of reasons why I agree with you. Bret was the right choice at the right time. But Bret, I would find it hard to believe that Vince looked at Bret as anything more than a transitional champion until he found the next Hulk Hogan, whether it be the Warrior, Luger, or somebody like that. I don't think that Vince looked at Bret as being the guy because Bret didn't have that charisma, much like Lex didn't.
Yeah. And with Lex too, I use this when Roman Reigns was being booed, when he was being by the men, mostly the kids and women were cheering him, but for years he was being pushed as a babyface, and people are trying to figure out what isn't working. And the phrase that I came up with is he doesn't seem emotionally accessible in a way that a Hulk Hogan did or a John Cena did. There was it's a hard to quantify connection with the crowd, and Hulk had it, Cena had it, many other people had it, but Lex Luger also didn't have it. There was just something there that felt more performative than just a genuine bond. And I'm not saying wrestlers who come across as having a genuine bond don't clock out and don't care about the fans. They're just good at portraying it. Some people genuinely do. Some people who really appreciate fans, it doesn't come across that they do. So I'm don't mean to say in real life how they feel, but Lex tried to look like he cared deeply about fan support. Roman didn't even try. Like, it just wasn't his thing. And that's just his personality. It worked in his favor in latter years in the bloodline. And now He's more authentically himself. But I will say in Lex's defense, I was at Mall of America when the Lex Express bus tour stopped there. And I was kind of, shadowing him a little bit to see how things were going for the official stuff. And then after it was over, he was ahead of me leaving the building, and he was in the main floor lobby at Mall of America, which Eric knows well. And they have the double doors because we have winters, so you got to stop the wind from coming in. And two people came up, a parent and a kid came up and asked for an autograph. No cameras, no PR people, no nothing. And people would think, well, Lex will blow him off. The cameras aren't on. No, he bent down, talked to her, signed her autograph. He was super sweet, super nice. He tried so hard to make that Lex Express tour work. He gave Vince everything he had. So, and including when the cameras were off. And I always remember that. I was like, I believe that. So anyway, that's now other people may disagree that Lex was the right person to go with, but I think what I saw was Lex seeing a lot of dollar signs and trying to do the right thing. There might be conflicting stories out there. There might have been frustrations with him in different places at times. But what I saw was someone trying really hard to make something work. But he was a derivative kind of carbon copy of Hulk, and it wasn't the right time for him.
I do want to spend a little time talking about Hulk Hogan and certainly Lex Luger in WCW. But before we do, I want to remind you that we're live. And if you've got a question for Eric or for Wade, let's keep them coming. We're going to be answering some of your questions. How about this right at the top of the show, Wade? You got a little love from Efren, big fan of the show, friend of the show.
Efren.
He says, I love Wade Keller. Well, we love you. And thanks for hanging out with us today, Efren. Shout out to John Thompson for throwing in for the calls. Appreciate you. He's saying he hopes we knock it out of the park today. If you got a question, keep them coming. Here's one from Dan. I know they don't want to do this. How would you feel if TKO got away from WrestleMania because that is a Vince McMahon creation since they want to erase Vince from history? Wade, I'd put the chances of that near zero. What say you?
Can you go lower than zero? Yeah, they've washed their hands of Vince McMahon, but they don't have to apologize for using a trademark that he was around for and approved. Yeah, WrestleMania is I don't know what the value of the name WrestleMania is, but I mean it's one of the top brands. It's maybe the top trademark in professional wrestling. I mean, I don't know, it'd be in the top 5. Monday Night Raw is good. Hulk Hogan obviously is good. I mean, but WrestleMania is, they're washing their hands of Vince in different ways, and understandably so, and they ought to. But I don't think fans see WrestleMania and think, oh, they're still capitalizing off of that disgraced, former promoter.
I think this whole obviously wasn't the intent, because this was originally Vince McMahon's idea going back to 18 or 19. But I think this documentary and the way it was laid out there and the timing of it is designed, maybe it's just a great coincidence, literally designed to put a bullet in any any connective tissue between Vince McMahon and WWE. This documentary was designed, particularly the last episode, to completely divorce themselves. That's why I've been scratching my head. Why is Netflix doing it now? They just are investing $5 billion in WWE. Why would you put something out there that could potentially damage the brand and create a challenge for this to get a return on the investment of that $5 billion? Why would you do that? And there's no good answer except for, by the way they ended that last episode, it's just like they drove a stake through his heart. And I think it was intentional to separate themselves. And I don't think they're going to look back. And I don't think we'll ever again see a reference of Vince McMahon in WWE.
Yeah, somebody asked on one of my podcasts, if Vince died sometime soon, how would it be handled on WWE television?
Wow.
I mean, that's the test is, do they go, well, he's dead, so now we have to do a tribute to him because of his history? No, I don't think they do a tribute. I think they acknowledge it. They probably put 4 pictures of him on the screen, in like a divided quad screen, Vince the announcer, Vince and the Monday Night Warrior, whatever. And they put a little in memoriam and then they move on. I don't think the relationship, I don't think Paul Levesque and Stephanie would object to minimal. I mean, everything I hear, it's and Shane doesn't have any say. So I don't think there's any force within WWE corporate wanting to celebrate Vince. And I think, if he died, it would be awkward and they would have to acknowledge it. I think they would do the bare minimum without seeming like they were vindictive, or, trying to kick dirt on him, on his grave. And that's, I think, where everybody in that company is with him. I mean, it's the stuff that's come out is, he'll might have his day in court, but I mean, there's stuff that just is there that he'd be pushing back on if he could, that he hasn't, that to me sort of, is worthy of him being grouped in the men of his generation who should be canceled and seen, unfortunately, as their final chapter, the defining way people look at him. I mean, this documentary it's fun, but there's a dark cloud every time you're looking at Vince going, oh, that's a really interesting answer on something completely irrelevant compared to what he's accused of doing. That's in your head the whole time, but he is a big part of wrestling history. So, the story, I'm glad the story got to be told and we got to see the interview. But in the end, I think Eric's right. I don't think Netflix would have put this out if it felt like they were trying to reassociate with him or protect him or celebrate him in any way. And I thought this was, with some flaws, but some strong points too. Just a genuine attempt, the first 4 parts, just tell a wrestling story, a Vince McMahon wrestling story.
One of the things that I was sort of shocked that I didn't expect going into it, Wade, is how sad I would feel just about the effect that all of this had on the family. I mean, I think most of us listening to this want to like Vince for the things he brought to our fandom and our enjoyment of wrestling, but we certainly hate so many of the actions that we've read about and heard about. But I think what we as fans sometimes watching on television kind of get lost in is, hey, this is a real life family. And as it's not really all that uncommon with a lot of families, unfortunately, but people get estranged and families get fractured. And that sort of came through. There was a sense of sadness whenever we would hear from Linda or we would hear from Shane. And I don't know, that just really jumped off the screen for me. What about you, Wade?
Yeah. I mean, what I hear about the family dynamic is it's been tense and frayed for a while, but I mean, Stephanie McMahon, her relationship with her dad, and it came through with the way that she defended him over the decades after the steroid trial. The government was a witch hunt; they're out to get us. She adored him. At the SummerSlam press conference when Jesse Ventura was going to be was special referee, I took a photo of Vince and Stephanie together, and I mean, it was like they just seemed so. It was just this picturesque father-daughter photo when they posed for the photo, and even when they weren't posing for the photo, like there was a real connection and chemistry there, and it's not there now. I mean, Stephanie, the timing of her resignation when Vince forced his way back, the way that she's spoken publicly now. I mean, if you look at it through the lens of she wants nothing to do with him anymore, there's nothing inconsistent. That she's crushed and devastated by him. There's nothing inconsistent with what she said and done that's inconsistent with that. I haven't talked to her. I don't know how she feels today about it, but so I don't want to overstate my knowledge of her relationship with him, but I know people who know in recent years, and it's frayed and it's sad. And Shane's, kind of a, he's a kind of a frat boy son who, just doesn't want to grow up, and he didn't really have to, tried to be taken seriously a few times. And, as the story told in part 1, Vince Jr. wanted the approval of his dad, and he sort of got it right before he died, but that was difficult. I think Vince wanted to be different than his dad was, but he couldn't help in some ways, I think, with Shane to have, a lot of expectations for him. And I think Shane's wrestling mind and business acumen didn't live up to what Vince would have designed from scratch from the ground up if he could. And I think Shane, knows Vince felt that way about him. And so then this stuff happens, and it's even more difficult for everybody, because Shane isn't the heir apparent. And now the McMahon name that, Shane and Stephanie obviously have and carry with them, it doesn't mean what it once did. I think they're, crushed. I mean, I think they knew their dad had flaws. I just don't think to this extent, they knew it was, I don't think they knew it was going on to this extent until
I agree with that. I agree with everything you said about Stephanie and Vince. I was on a plane with them, for that 4 or 5 months. I was up there every week, and
oh yeah,
you could just, there was so much love and respect there between the two of them, and Vince equally adored Stephanie.
Yeah.
And even I think internally we all, in a not so serious way, but not making fun of anybody, Stephanie really she had a lot of the very similar characteristics of Vince when it came to business. Now, she was much more pleasant to be around. Don't get me wrong. but there were elements of there were elements of Vince in Stephanie, so much so that, I took separate meetings with her in a group, not really one-on-one, but in a group of other people. And I would listen to her lead a meeting, and it would be like, even if you didn't know they were related, after about 15 minutes, she'd go, I wonder if they're related. She was so similar to Vince in so many ways.
Yeah.
And Shane was exactly the opposite. And Vince, one time it was a one-on-one meeting with Vince. It was late night, as he typically were. And Vince got a call from Shane. And I wasn't paying attention to I didn't want to eavesdrop. I was just stuck in a room with him. So I wasn't paying too close attention. And I don't know what the conversation was, but when Vince hung up, he goes, he's just like his mother.
Yep.
He's just too nice. Okay.
I heard that over the years.
The way he said it, it was like,
yeah.
Oh, he's just like his mother.
Oh, man.
Way too nice. It wasn't like, oh, he's just like his mother. It was, he wasn't impressed. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. People always said Shane was Linda's son and Stephanie was Vince's daughter, and sometimes that happens. You get, traits that are more similar to one parent than the other. But yeah, people adore Shane, but they also kind of roll their eyes when he comes up with his latest booking idea. So, it's just, it is what it is. But yeah, Shane, people like Shane. I can see Vince being like, he's too nice. Yeah.
AOTV Productions is with us here live, and he points out something that I got to admit I didn't even think about until Wade brought it up. I'm surprised of all the controversial topics, they didn't mention the incident with Vince and Nails. Are you surprised that didn't come out, Wade? Like, that does feel like something they would have mentioned. Maybe it could have been a blip, but was there nothing to it, you think?
It wasn't it's not the most commonly talked about topic because Nails is sort of a fringe figure. But I have talked about it being a turning point. I think it was ESPN that interviewed. It was ESPN that did the documentary on that, and I brought it up, and they included it in it. So it's a key point. But 6 hours is a lot. Is a lot. A 6-part series, a little under 6 hours. But you can't cover everything. This wasn't. I think you could do a 4-part series on just the trial, and I didn't watch that thinking, oh, they left something super important out. Because in a way, they glossed over the trial. To me, because there's living through it and talking about it so much, there's so much to it. But I actually think that if that was a cutoff point for how much time they gave to it, I don't know that Nails makes the cut, because I didn't sense this was meant to be into the granular nature of why the jury decided why they decided. I think the broad brushstrokes didn't need to get into the nuance of what might have swayed the jury compared, Rick Rude versus Nails, for instance. The Hogan was the big part of it, and I think they covered that, pretty well.
Let's talk about the next piece of the documentary, Eric. We're going to hear from Hulk Hogan, where he says, man, WCW was just paying so much more money. It's like I had died and gone to wrestling heaven with these crazy deals I was able to cut walking in. So a lot of people are going to lay that at your feet and say, oh, here goes ATM Eric. But I don't think anybody would argue that without Hogan, WCW wouldn't have reached the same heights of success. So in the end, it's a bet that paid off. But when you hear your pal sort of just leaning into that ATM Eric thing, oh, what a crazy deal I cut. Are you sort of rolling your eyes, or do you think, yeah, and you earned every bit, you son of a gun?
I chuckled. Now, I used, 10, 15 years ago, something like that would probably piss me off, make me reach for the phone and have a conversation. But now it's just, first of all, it's Hulk is Hulk. He tends to go in the direction the wind is blowing when it comes to narrative like that. And Hulk knows that's the narrative. It's been out there for a long time, thanks to Wade Keller and people like him. I'm just kidding. We were doing so well until that moment. It's low-hanging fruit, and I had to pick it. But here's the Hulk Hogan deal. He had 4 pay-per-views with 4 weeks of TV prior to each pay-per-view. And he got paid $500,000 a pay-per-view. That was less money than he was making per pay-per-view in WWE, or probably close on average, throw in WrestleMania. So it wasn't, now he wasn't on the road. So if you look at it on a per diem basis or a per day basis, yes, we were paying way more. But for what we were asking him to do, it was a lot of money at the time, but it wasn't that much money compared to, I had guys that were, I couldn't put 600 people in the Gainesville Civic Auditorium with it. We were paying $750,000 a year too. So if you step back and you take your wrestling emotion and the narrative kind of out of it all, and you go, wait a minute, I got 3 guys over here making $750 a piece, and I can't put 1,200 people, in a small town arena. But I got a guy over here that's got a track record of making millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars just in merchandise. Am I going to take that risk? Yeah, all day long. And it was a risk that paid off. But of course, the way Hulk says it, to your point, it's like, and that's the thing that does still get slightly under my skin, is this narrative that, and they said it in the documentary. You heard, Shane said it. Not that Shane was there, he didn't know, but he's parroting what he's heard, is that Ted Turner opened up his checkbook. No, he didn't. I spent the first 16 months of my executive career counting pencils and cutting costs and reducing my talent roster because certain people had travel that was too high. Paul Levesque wanted to come to work for us, and I only paid him $75,000 because, as I told him, and he has since repeated in public, I called him a GUD, geographically undesirable, meaning I wasn't going to fly him all the way from Boston or wherever he lived to Atlanta to do TV. So if he wanted to work for me, he had to come to Atlanta. And he was a little disappointed because he heard we flew everybody in every week. So, yeah, Ted did open up his checkbook for Hulk Hogan, but he did so because WCW demonstrated that we could reduce costs. We saved a lot of money. The Disney MGM Studio initiative was really more about economies of scale than it was anything else. There were other benefits, of course, but it was really an economy of scale move. And if there was one thing, in fact, I got a letter from Bill Shaw talking about it. I kept it on my refrigerator for a long time. I was so proud of it because Bill Shaw, who was my boss, VP of Human Resources at Turner Broadcasting, made reference to the risk of Disney and the vision of doing it there is one of the things that made Ted feel like it was time to reinvest in WCW. But it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't Ted Turner going, I'm just going to write the checks. You whatever you want, Eric. That wasn't the case. And Hulk was just kind of, like I say, going with the direction the wind is blowing in, and depending on who he's talking to and why.
We should talk a little bit about the Lex Luger jump to Nitro. I mean, it is a major moment. It's on the very first Nitro, but Vince's reaction to this is really what I was fascinated with. He sort of summed it up, Wade, by saying, all I'd ever dealt with was handshakes, and now all that was over. Almost implying like it broke his heart. But didn't he use that same tactic with promoters and their television stations? I mean, Vince would even continue after he's talking about Lex jumping ship here, and they're doing a cutaway of Lex going nose to nose with Hulk Hogan. Oh, you take these guys and you build them up, and then poof, they just leave. Sort of like Lex Luger left WCW to come to the WWF, and sort of like Hulk Hogan left the AWA to come to the WWF. And maybe that's the most fascinating thing of the episode to me is when Ted Turner was trying to do this, well, he was trying to hurt Vince. But when Vince is doing it to everyone else, well, he was simply trying to grow his business. I just think that was so revealing. It lacked such self-awareness. It had to make you laugh, Eric. What'd you think of that?
I mean, the hypocrisy was just, I mean, I just chuckled and I've been aware of this for a long time, but when you hear Vince say it, it's like, are you fucking kidding me, Vince? Are you actually going to say that publicly? Because nobody's buying it. Nobody that's thinking or that knows even a little bit about what went on back then. But yeah, it wasn't just AWA. And, Wade, you probably paid more attention to this at the time than I did before I started working for the AWA. But it was Gene Okerlund, it was Bobby Heenan, it was everybody. Kurt Hennig left. Hennig? Are you kidding? Larry the Axe's son. I mean, unofficial partner in the AWA for the most part, and it devastated Vern. It killed him. Vern hung on as long as he could, but he mortgaged himself to death and eventually ran out of money because of what Vince did and the way Vince did it. So yeah, there's a lot of, there's a lot of whining going on. There's a reason why I called them the World Whining Federation back then. This is a perfect example of it, man.
Yes. That was so fun to watch the Vince react to that whole era because of the hypocrisy. One thing the documentary didn't bring up, because Vince, this was an era, by the way, and Vince and Eric, I don't know how much you know this, but Vince would call me and complain about Ted Turner. He would call me out of blue, and he's like, Wade, I've got all these clippings on my desk. Ted Turner's weird. You need to write more about what a weird guy this is. He's so out there. He says these crazy things. He was obsessed with Ted Turner, legitimately. And, you always talked about Ted, and I always said, Ted is sort of peripherally paying attention. Vince's battle is with Eric Bischoff, not Ted Turner. But obviously, Vince explained and you explained. I mean, it's, makes Vince feel more sympathetic if he's talking about Ted instead of Eric.
And he wanted you to write that way, and I'm sure he wanted other people to write that way too. So when he got on the phone and had a conversation, it wasn't because I'm going to call my buddy Wade,
right,
or my buddy Dave, or my buddy anybody. Yeah. I'm going to call these guys because, oh, damn, I'm Vince McMahon. They're going to write what I want them to write, or charm you into writing what he wanted you to write.
Yes, and he's just. You could tell he just wanted to vent about it. He was feeling nervous, but in the documentary, we said, wow, this is brutal. You helped get these talents over, you built them, and then all of a sudden, poof, they're gone. the hypocrisy of how he built, and you listed names. I mean, Bobby Heenan, Jesse Ventura, and the documentary showed these people, some of these names too. Hulk Hogan was in the WWF first, but when he came to the AWA, that's when Hulkamania was born. That was Vernon Greg Gagne and Hulk himself inventing due to crowd reaction and celebrity and him just sort of, that was the right time for that type of character. Again, Hulk was very different than Vern when we talk about top stars not looking like the previous top star. And he was, different than the Crusher too. So the idea that Vince thinks no one that he created and curated and turned into a big star should ever go work somewhere else, yet he wants to take advantage of the independent contractor status and not offer health insurance and all that stuff. I mean, and then the hypocrisy of Razor Ramon. Razor Ramon in WCW basically did the same gimmick as Razor Ramon, other than
here we go again. I went off. I lost my freaking mind yesterday when this came up.
Yes,
I had to call Dave Silver, our producer, when I was done. I said, I kind of used some words I should probably use on a YouTube show. So do you mind clipping those? But yeah, oh my God, don't even get me started.
So the idea that that Vince said, if a character worked for him, they couldn't go somewhere else. When the national expansion was him plucking top wrestlers from all these other territories. And yes, he took him to higher levels and all that. But when he got called on the hypocrisy, he sort of admitted, well, sometimes I say things to sway public narrative, but I don't really believe them. And I guess that was a good admission. It was one of the highlights, I would argue, of the whole documentary is Vince finally being called up on his hypocrisy. And when Vince would complain about, Ted going head-to-head with Raw, let's talk about 1997 Survivor Series. That event was invented to put Jim Crockett Jr. out of business by pushing Starrcade off a pay-per-view because you couldn't be, he went head-to-head aggressively and in a predatory fashion. I've, called him out on this forever. It's just, Vince, when Vince whined, Eric, he was a whiner. I mean, he wasn't just a whiner, he was a hypocrite about several key things and stealing talent from him and going head to head. I mean, it's just, that's how he built things. And, I was hoping he'd have some nuanced difference I never thought of, and he didn't. He just says, yeah, he's just putting it out there because it sounded good.
And he comes out and he looks right down the barrel of the camera and he said something like, as a businessman, you have to say things you don't feel as a way of thought control.
Yes.
And it's like, so you're just admitting you're full of shit. I mean, my goodness, you just goodbye any credibility. Let's talk a little bit about some more of this compete business, because this really jumped off the page to me. He's talking about Ted Turner saying you have all these resources and you're just trying to hurt a family-owned business. Boy, did every promoter around the country say that about Vince once upon a time? Yes. Yeah. And he even says Ted's philosophy was, let's go hurt my competitor. This was mine. I want to compete. But if you go back and you start talking about, the infancy of pay-per-view, Vince McMahon created Survivor Series to sabotage Starrcade. He created the Royal Rumble as a free television event to sabotage the Bunkhouse Stampede. He wasn't competing. He was trying to block other businesses from doing their own pay-per-view. I mean, the hypocrisy here was just off the charts. This is peak Vince McMahon.
He called me and complained they could be on any night of the week. Why are they doing Mondays now? And I got him. I quoted him saying he might blink first because he was thinking of moving Raw to another night. And I quoted him in a cover story in the Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter on that, saying, yeah, we might have to blink first if we if it hurts our viewership, because Vince was living hand to mouth for
Yes.
ticket sales and pay-per-views. And it bothered him that Ted Turner had this diversity to him. And, Vince ended up wanting diversity, World Bodybuilding Federation and ICO Pro. And then later, the nightclub and all the ventures he did, that kind of all failed, but he wanted to be diversified too. And, that's fine. I mean, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, Vince was a hypocrite about a lot of things, and not wanting people to go head to head and framing it as, oh, they're trying to put me out of business. It was just, and then the other thing too, Vince said, I believe in the law of the jungle, and you go after the injured.
Yes.
I mean, does that not? I mean, I think there was a moment of self-awareness in the documentary where he acknowledged, well, I guess the law of the jungle, and I was injured and they came after me. I mean, it was almost like he was sort of being self-reflective about his own hypocrisy for a minute there. And I think, obviously, to this day, or Eric can disagree, maybe as evidence otherwise, that he respects the hell out of Eric for bringing it to him. People who do what Vince does, even at a smaller scale or for a shorter period of time, or whatever it is, I think he respects people who book and promote, and take chances, to compete with him. I think ultimately, even if he fights hard, he respects that.
I've never told this story before, but hey, we're all telling first. Why not? I think, Wade, you may have remembered the little dust up I had when I was doing the second Starcast in Vegas. I'd booked The Undertaker, and it got a lot of buzz. And then, of course, magically, The Undertaker got pulled after being told he could do outside appearances. Well, not that one. And he signed what at the time was reported as being a lifetime contract. Well, I thought it might be cute. So I found Vince McMahon's brother, and I tried to book Vince McMahon's brother to come to StarCast along with Brian Lee and Eric Angle. I was going to have fun with everybody who had been pulled from StarCast. And we had a good exchange, myself and Vince's brother, before he passed. And then my phone rings, and I was summoned. So the next time WWE came to Birmingham, Vince asked if he could meet me, and wanted to meet me and shake my hand, and told me it took a lot of balls to reach out to his brother. Goddamn, pal, blah, blah, blah. And I think it speaks to what you're saying about he did respect that Eric was like, hey, you know what? I'm going to push back. So on the one hand, where he says law of the jungle, and on the other hand, you hear Hulk Hogan say, hey, here's how Vince feels about his competition. He wants to destroy it and then eat it. And then he sees Eric go on Nitro and start reading the taped Raw results. Like, you've seen it all before, Wade, but when you saw Eric read those results, what are you thinking, and how did you think Vince was going to respond to that?
I thought that's Eric I know.
Yes.
I mean, Eric was brash and ballsy. I mean, that it didn't surprise me. I wasn't like, oh, Eric is more meek than to do that. You were going for it. It was awesome. I mean, I loved the competition. Vince, if Vince was alive and Eric was taped, he would have found a way to, and he felt it was to his advantage, he would have done the same thing. It wasn't, but it was ballsy and brash in the sense that it wasn't an established technique that promoters used. But I mean, in the AWA, when Vince took AWA's talent, AWA was like, oh, these imposters who couldn't cut it in the AWA, and they went to the WWF, and they're not the real wrestlers. We're the main, Wally Carbo's saying this, trying to rah AWA fans into sticking with them as a home promotion to support. I mean, when promoters go to war, they go to war, and I mean, within reason, obviously. But what Eric did wasn't out of bounds. Just going, that show's pre-taped. Here's what happened. Now stay here because you don't know what's going to happen because we're live. That was just smart, and it was part of the formula that made Nitro work.
And we had nothing to lose, which makes it easy to take risks when your back's up against the wall and you've got a big opportunity. And if it fails, well, guess what? You're going to go right back to what you were doing. Maybe not have been me. It might have been my job, but I wasn't worried about that, to be honest. WCW would have been okay if Nitro would have failed. They would have kept doing what they were doing on Saturday night. But yeah, when you got nothing to lose, it's fun.
I think, in fairness to Vince, and I'm curious for Eric's thought on this, I'd say the only point that Vince made, I shouldn't say the only point, but the main point that comes to mind right now, that Vince made that I thought had some merit was they can afford to put all their main events on Nitro, all their big matches on Nitro, and pull viewers from Raw. And this was an argument Vince made because they don't need to make money on house shows because they can live off of profits from other divisions. And so in his mind, that was the predatory, unfair aspect, that they actually don't need to. His argument was they don't need to make money the way we do, where we're, because if you look at Raw results before Nitro, it was like the highlight of Raw, 30 years ago was Jerry Lawler complaining about Doink saying something mean to him, and then a hillbilly squash match to end. So Nitro changed the game. Now, it turned out it was great for Vince because he's, and WWE now because everybody's raking in money on giving away main event matches on cable. That's a cash cow now. But then TV was still a loss leader, and they didn't want to give away big matches. And Vince's idea was Ted can lose money for years, and we can't. But if we give away matches to compete with them on cable, we can't now advertise them for pay-per-view and house shows. That was the only time where I was like, I can see where I didn't think that was. It sort of is whining, but Vince was so aggressive himself in his own ways and the advantages he had, it still is sort of hypocritical. But I understood that point, and I think that's where Vince was really scared. Is I'm not competing with someone who has to make money now, hand to mouth like we are.
And I understand why he would think that, partially because that's what he wanted to think, but it wasn't true at all. There was a gun to our head. I mean, when I took the job, Bill Shaw told me, Ted Turner wants this company to make at least $1 of profit by the end of next year, or he's going to pull the plug. So there was no, well, we can afford to do this because Ted's comfortable losing money. That was a narrative, and it might have been true for a while in the very beginning. A lot of businesses are willing to lose money for the first 2 or 3 years as long as things are trending in the right direction. Yeah. But after a certain amount of time, if they don't reverse that trend and start making money, you pull the plug. That's where WCW was. There was never a conversation. I never had one conversation with anybody from Turner Finance, the people that I had to answer to, quite frankly, where they said, yeah, go ahead and load up your TVs because, we only care about the TV. And if WCW makes money or not doesn't matter. It was exactly the opposite of that. But I understand Vince wouldn't know that. And it would be easy to make that assumption based on what you think you know, but it wasn't accurate at all.
So the business formula was different, but it didn't mean that you didn't face some of the same. You didn't face challenges. They just happened to be different than Vince in terms of the timeline to make money. Vince needed it to pay the bills. You needed it to keep Turner funding the division.
Right. They were going to pull the plug. If we didn't turn a profit, they were going to pull the plug. And my philosophy about loading up and this is, again, Vince wouldn't have known this because he and I had never had a conversation and he didn't know me. But without sounding corny, I went into it with the idea that if you build it, they will come. Our pay-per-view business, as you know, Wade, probably can recall better than even I can because I can't remember shit anymore. Our pay-per-view business was fucking horrible. Yeah. We didn't have any. It was the only really line item in terms of revenue that we could control. But it was horrible in relations to the rest of our operating budget. It just wasn't very, very successful. We had zero licensing. We had almost no merchandising. Yeah. So the 4 tables of revenue that typically propped up the professional wrestling model, at that time at least, it was television, pay-per-view, licensing, and ticket sales. Licensing and merchandising together, and ticket sales. Those were your 4 main revenue streams. WCW got no money for television. In fact, we had to produce our own at our cost. Now, some of that was offset because Turner supplied some production services, but a lot of it we had to pay for. And we got no license fee. We didn't have any licensing. We didn't have any merchandising. And every time we went out the door to do a live event, we got our asses kicked and we lost money. So the only thing we had was pay-per-view, and it wasn't cutting it. So my thought process was, again, Vince wouldn't know this, is if you build it, they'll come, meaning if I get my television ratings up, at the end of the day, it's always going to be a mathematical formula. If you're providing, you're producing something reasonably compelling, that you're going to get a percentage of the overall viewership. It's like direct sales. You're going to get a 3% return. You put out 1,000 direct mail pieces of advertising and 3% of the people are going to respond to it. So my thought was, if I load up my TV and create some good stories, load up my TV and make sure that to the best of my ability, which was limited at that time, and I admit that creatively, to the best of my ability, pay those stories off on a pay-per-view, the pay-per-view revenues will come up. And 2 things did happen. I loaded up the TV and our ratings went up, and oh, by the way, so did our pay-per-view revenue. So the form or the risk turned out to be true, but again, Vince couldn't have known that was my thinking. it would have looked like from the outside. Oh, fuck, they don't care. No, it was the opposite. Cared a lot, just not for the reasons you think.
And a big part of the formula that caused the boom period for WCW and Nitro was wrestlers wanted to work there because they didn't have to work as many dates. And, we saw the price people paid 10, 15 years later for the bumps and the CTE and the wear and tear and the lost family time. And Bret talked about that. And that's part of why Bret felt so bad about what happened in Montreal. He's like, I miss these Christmases and all that. But wrestlers were like, you're going to pay me that much and that many fewer dates. It wasn't just Hulk Hogan. I mean, he got the sweetest deal, but he earned it through what he had become. But obviously it was a big deal for Hall and Nash too. Wrestlers in the WWF were jealous of the deals WCW wrestlers had. But what that meant was our wrestlers are going to be healthy and happy, and they're going to want to come here. And that's going to help us load up the roster and thus draw bigger ratings and draw bigger on pay-per-view, because house shows weren't still the carryover formula. They weren't, the legacy revenue source that it was for the WWF. And Vince didn't want to give up his legacy sources of revenue.
Yeah, you're right about everything about the healthy and happy part. They came over and they were healthy and happy for about an hour, maybe two.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the Billionaire Ted skits. We've heard everybody in this documentary and a lot of wrestlers through the years say, oh, Vince doesn't sell. But Billionaire Ted says, well, once upon a time, Vince was selling pretty good. Wade, do you remember the discussion of Ted using lithium being a hot button issue back then? That was touched on here, and I don't remember that being an issue, but maybe I missed it.
I don't recall that being a big deal. I mean, a lot was being thrown out there. I mean, I'm sure it raised an eyebrow, but I mean, it was like, it's a parody. It felt like a cheap shot, but I thought it was interesting. I don't recall that being a thing where like Ted's like, or, USA Network said, oh, that's going too far. And I thought that was interesting. The USA president is on there going, oh, we're friendly competition and that was going too far. Let's take these down. But I probably, I have to go back and look at my write-up, but I probably pointed out, ooh, that seemed to like going a little further. And they didn't need to do it. I don't, Eric, do you have any regret over anything that you said that you thought, I don't know how you feel about the lithium line, but do you think that crossed the line? And is there anything you would just volunteer and go, yeah, in the heat of the battle, I said this and I wish I hadn't?
Oh, fuck. I don't know. It depends. Sure. Are you kidding me? you covered me for 20 years, dude. You know the answer to that question. I just don't remember what it would be.
Yeah. Fair enough.
But of course, and you know what? I don't even remember the lithium line, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I thought the whole thing was kind of ridiculous and funny.
Yeah.
And I took it as like, I made the bitch sell. Yeah.
Did you know that the footage of Ted Turner watching it and laughing was, I thought, fascinating in the documentary? I don't remember seeing that. Maybe I haven't forgot, but I mean, because it was a long time ago, but showing Ted watching on a monitor, slapping his knee and laughing at the parody and, oh, that's me. And that's how that was, I mean, when we say the documentary didn't offer anything new, maybe I just forgot some things, but I thought there was some, video clips and stuff and the way the story was told that I found it compelling. I want to, rewatch it.
Eric, when you heard the story of Scott and Kevin being asked to do a Billionaire Ted skit but declining, was that the first time you'd heard that, or had you heard that back in the day?
No, that was the first time I'd heard that.
Yeah,
I mean, Kevin may have. I mean, somebody may have shared that with me at one point in time, but it didn't register. And there might have been alcohol involved. Who knows? But yeah, this was the first time I'd heard it or remembered hearing it.
Wade, what did you think of the curtain call? I mean, was it a big deal for you personally in 1996? I mean, by that point, the cat was out of the bag for guys like you and I, but did you think that was a cardinal sin, the curtain call in 1996?
No. I mean, it wasn't not a story. I mean, it was a headline story. It was worthy of being a headline story, but I feel like it's a little bit overblown. I thought the documentary was, I don't know if it's Bruce Pritchard or who, but just like, it was the end of kayfabe. And it's like, that ended a while ago, and then I'm not a big proponent of like the idea that, that when you mix reality in that it's like by definition more compelling and better for the audience. I think, you should tell the best story you can tell. And if it happens to match reality, that's a bonus. But I don't think you should seek out reality at the expense of better stories that you can tell if that real story is just going to confuse everything. Like even the CM Punk pipe bomb promo, like I talked to wrestlers afterwards who were like, we don't get to do that. And now everything we're doing on the rest of the show feels fake because Punk broke the fourth wall. I understand the why old timers, or I'm trying to think of a better term than that, but people who are kind of still thinking we should have more respect for giving fans an immersive experience where at least, sort of between the proverbial opening and closing credits, we keep a straight face, we don't break character. But that was a moment in time that was significant. It was the end of something. The headline story in the Torch, number 389, was the click break character in MSG finale. And I wrote about it, but it I don't think it was like this. Like, I didn't see it as like a monumental historical moment, I guess, is a short answer to your question, Conrad.
Eric, you're running WCW at the time. You've got two of these talent coming over. Were you, did you have any strong feelings one way or another about the curtain call in 1996?
Didn't care. I mean, I was aware of it, but I know people think that I was paying attention to what was going on in WWE and I was watching your shows and all that. Nothing could be further from the truth. Anything that I heard about WWE or anything I was aware of about WWE at the time, generally I was told. If it was something that somebody felt like I should have seen, I'll have a videotape on my desk, on Tuesday or Wednesday. But I heard it, didn't care. I mean, it's just like Bret Hart. When Bret Hart called me and said, "Oh, Vince wants me to drop the belt. What should I do?" I said, "Drop the belt. Of course, drop the belt. It's no big deal. You're Bret freaking Hart. Nobody's going to care. The audience knows you're coming. The audience knows you're going to leave the belt there. So leave the belt there. Come on, let's go." It just, that kind of stuff never mattered to me, to be honest.
And like in the Pro Wrestling Torch Newsletter, the week after it happened, it was in the Torch Newsletter, it was our second item after the King of the Ring lineup being updated. Like, this wasn't like this. It wasn't like the, Montreal Screwjob. That was like, tons of articles and cover stories on it. I just said some wrestlers were upset with the Clique's cavalier actions, believing it to be them pushing the envelope to show their power at the expense of company storylines. It damaged what had been a cooling of tension in the locker room regarding Michaels and the Clique. It wasn't I think the documentary made a little bit more of it than they should have.
I agree.
Yeah.
It was interesting to see Cody say he thought it was cool as a young fan, but Stephanie was pretty upset about it. Undertaker didn't like it. Yep. And Bret even called it the day the wrestling died, which I thought was maybe being a little dramatic.
It was melodramatic. He's the one who said, yeah, it was.
Yeah, but this is the guy that referred to himself as the man who pulled the sword out of the stone.
Well, that's true. I just think the idea of, on some level, we do a cutaway then of the Undertaker talking about how he tries to keep kayfabe, and I get that. But the Undertaker living the gimmick as a dead man in 1996 seems a little more silly to me than four guys hugging in bright colored spandex. Like, who cares? Like, one of these things is like bizarre, and the others, those guys must be friends in real life. It seems silly to me to die on that hill.
I thought, Conrad, that Undertaker Markello had a great answer to that. He's just like, I felt I owed it to my fans to make them just wonder, does he believe his own gimmick? And I think that's fine. Like, I mean, I talked to Matt McCarthy, an ex-WWE writer, dozens of times on my podcast. Search Wade Keller on your podcast app to subscribe. Cheap, quick plug there. Put out a lot of shows during the week. And I talked to him a lot. And we'd always talk. He was a stand-up comedian too. And he would talk about how stand-up comedians start off and they get kind of a persona that works. And they kind of sometimes outgrow it if they're doing the bit for 15, 20 years, but they keep the persona, even though they've changed. They started off single and drinking, and now they're sober and have a family. But they keep the persona up as a stand-up comedian, and they don't put publicity out. They don't go out of their way to put up publicity to say, I'm not really like this anymore, because their fans want to bond with them over the person they've had. Same with rock bands. Like, there's an identity that it bonds you with fans. Don't go out of your way to break that, even if it's not true anymore. It doesn't mean you're lying. It doesn't mean you're looking down at your fans. Just, you want to give your fan base a story to believe in, and don't needlessly contradict it. And I think with Undertaker, everybody knew he didn't really go to the grocery store looking like that, but is he a little out there? There's some wrestlers where you're like, Kevin Sullivan. I mean, was he a little bit into devil worshiping in real life? He's not going to say, oh, no, I think that's BS. He's going to feed into that a little bit. So I didn't mind that. Conrad's right. It would be silly to think he's really like that, but I also don't think it benefits anyone for a wrestler to go out of their way to present something that offsets what people
Yes.
believe they might really be like. I think that's kind of part of the fun of wrestling, and that's where I think the breaking character a little bit at MSG hurt, but it was not televised. It was covered by Pro Wrestling Torch. It wasn't like nobody was going to really know, and the MSG crowd aren't going to be like, what? I mean, people, I just think, but if it was in 1978, that'd be different, or not, even 1983, maybe it'd be a little different, but I just didn't think it was that big of a deal, and Bret was melodramatic about it, and Vince kind of gave approval and then pulled approval. I mean, it wasn't really fair to Hunter, the way that all ended up playing out.
It was interesting too because Vince almost positioned it like, well, was I talked into this thing? Like
Yeah.
he had to be convinced. Like it's a house show. Who cares?
That's the thing. He was flippant about it for a reason, but then he
Yes.
felt because of the backlash in the locker room, he needed to
Yes,
have
and-
a scapegoat. Hunter didn't think of driving a scapegoat airport shuttle bus, but I mean, he kind of, Hunter was a scapegoat after that.
Yeah.
That's an AEW
Well,
reference for those who are not watching.
Let's talk a little bit about.
Which is a lot of people.
I appreciate the scapegoat. Let's talk a little bit about Hogan turning heel. Eric, you called this in the documentary, the high point of your career. I think, when you take a look at the history of WCW, Hogan turning heel and the creation of the NWO from an outsider, Wade, I mean, that's got to be the biggest thing WCW ever did, right?
Yeah, that was amazing. I mean, as Hogan talked about the documentary, people were, starting to catcall a little bit. His gimmick got a little old. And he's not the only baby face where fans kind of tired of him. I mean, that happened in wrestling. What's the AWA example where there was I wish I could remember right now. Like that just happened. Like fans would get tired and they would start wanting fresh people on top sometimes. That happened, but it was clear Hogan. It was smart to promote the WWF version of Hulk Hogan at first and get what you could out of it. But it was even smarter to sense if Hogan's willing to turn heel, the outsiders are great, but Hogan's going to take it to this next level. And people are going to be shocked. Not that when Vince McMahon became a heel character on TV, people who didn't live like all of us have on this podcast right now through Vince McMahon as a straight announcer who never acknowledged he ran the company. If you didn't live that in real time for like 10, 15, 20 years, you can't possibly know what it felt like to see him cut his first heel promo. And when he practiced in Memphis a few years before he did so nationally, it was like, that was a cover story, like a big deal. Vince played a character. Seeing Hulk Hogan be a heel, even though we played it in the, late 70s, early 80s, seeing Hulk Hogan after everything he had been, be nasty to fans, having lived through in real time, thinking you can barely fathom it in your head. It was huge to watch, even if it was rumored that it might happen. And of course, when something that compelling happens and that sharp of a turn happens to somebody who was rightfully described as a household name in the mid 80s, early WrestleMania years, that was a huge spark. And it was, I mean, amazing to watch. And the crowd reaction, the clips were just great watching. I mean, the reaction of the fans in the building to that happening, that's what you look for. You want somebody to care enough when someone turns to have that kind of reaction.
And, saying it was the highlight of my career. And I meant really that moment when he turned, that whatever it was, the 5 minutes after he dropped the leg on Savage, just the emotion and the energy, the vibe, not to sound, too out there, but it's like nothing I've ever experienced yet, since, or before. And I mean, it's one of the reasons that picture's up there behind me is because I think that moment, it's not that I think that's the greatest picture in the world, although I do like it a lot, but that moment to me represents a seismic shift, at least that I was a part of, in the wrestling industry in terms of history. That moment, the creation of the NWO, forced so many other things to happen, including the Attitude Era, that it changed the industry so significantly. You hear people talk, oh, it changed the wrestling landscape. Bullshit. Show me how. Show me why. That moment changed the trajectory of the industry, and I think is partly responsible for the success that the industry is seeing today, because it made wrestling, it forced wrestling to evolve as an entertainment property, as a television property. Nitro forced wrestling to evolve, forced WWE to evolve. because of what we were talking about earlier, putting our high quality stuff, our pay-per-view stars on TV. We're seeing that now, aren't we?
And I'm sure there's been, and I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head for this example, but there's been people who have played a certain role on television and movies their whole life, and then they get a part that goes way. I'm sure there's a bunch of people movie buffs who are just thinking of 8 examples off the top of their head, where it's like, oh, I want to see this person who's always been sweet and wholesome now play a bad guy.
I'll give you a perfect example, and I'm really horrible with names. I can't fucking remember anybody's names. Who's the Happy Gilmore actor?
Adam Sandler.
Adam Sandler. When Adam Sandler did a movie about 3 years ago, it was a dark movie.
Yeah,
Uncut Gems. Uncut
Gems.
Yep.
It's like, whoa.
There you go. Great example.
As an actor, you look for those opportunities. You got to be careful because if it's a shitty movie, you're fucked. But if you could find the right script and you're a character that's been playing the same type for a long time, and then you get that shot to do something that you think has half a chance of being really special, that changes everything for you.
And Hulk Hogan leaned into it right away, all in. I mean, that footage of him like that night, he embraced it, and it's why people want to see, John Cena go heel. It's just like we've seen everything we want to see of this character. Give us a good story that can show us a very different side of him. And he didn't go halfway into it. I mean, he was believable in that role right out of the gate. And that,
you know what, Wade, and I've never shared this, Conrad, I've never said this to you, but in this conversation, Wade is absolutely right. So much so that I was actually quite surprised because Hulk was very tentative. I had Kevin Sullivan sequester him at Kevin's house because I was afraid somebody was going to get to Hulk and make him change his mind, because he was predictably unpredictable when it came to commitments. Let's put it that way. And I was my concern after he got to the building, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I was relieved, but I'm thinking, oh man, what am I going to do in 2 weeks when this isn't fun for him anymore? Or he starts second guessing himself. After I just told Sting, you're not going to be the third guy. Thanks for hanging around dressed like that, but not tonight. But Hogan embraced that so much so quickly. I honestly think it was a relief, because the red and yellow Hulk Hogan in WCW was not working.
Yeah.
When you go out to center stage, after, the first couple of times he was there, it worked. Everybody, you got the Pavlovian response. Everybody reacted the way you should.
And the OMG, he's in WCW moment too.
Yes. Yeah. But after about a month or two, that fades away. And within about 6 months of that point in time, less than that, you were hearing enough of a smattering of boos, because he was the Northern, he's the Yankee. In that center stage crowd, there was still kind of a Southern crowd. And he represented WWE, so he was the enemy, and they were tired of him.
Yeah,
and he was getting those boos. And I think when he went out there and said, "Screw it, I'm going to do this," I think there was such a sense of relief that wrestling for him became fun again.
Yeah, and Hogan was. It sort of happened in TNA too. On a much smaller scale, like, who are these people coming in displacing AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels from the main events and Samoa Joe and all that. Think about the Ric Flair country aspect of WCW, and then Hogan, and Flair and Hogan, cross paths, but the idea of Hogan coming in and usurping, being the standard bearer of a brand that was so closely associated with Ric Flair, and a whole generation of wrestling fans were convinced. It's sort of like Bret Favre coming to the Vikings, Eric. Like, we got to cheer this guy now. Like, he's been the enemy for his whole career, and now he's our guy. I mean, it was an adjustment. So they were tired of him. It was stale. It was played out. People ready for a new era. You recognized all that, and Hogan embraced it when he realized it's going to work. But I don't think it was risky to do it. I think that underestimates how, I don't want to say it's obvious and take away the novelty and the balls that it took to do it, but like, it just felt like a risk worth taking that very likely would pay off. But Hogan had to play his part well, which he did.
Well, I think the risks for Hulk, we talked about it a lot. The risks for Hulk, and we talked about it a lot the year before when I tried to convince him to turn heel and he wouldn't do it. He threw me out of his house very politely. Let me take my beer with me, but God, but it was, he had a lot of deals on the side that had nothing to do with WCW, because he was that Hulk Hogan red and yellow character that sponsors, advertisers, and other companies still, recognized him as from back in the 80s. Even in the mid 90s, they recognized him as that 4, 5, 6 years later. And he was afraid that if he turned heel, that some of those commercial opportunities, endorsements and all that, what other stuff he had, movies and whatever deals he had going on, would evaporate. And that part, it was logical.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the risk in his mind.
And that was logical. He made a lot of money from ancillary sources. Yeah.
Vince said in the documentary that he and Terry always thought Hulk Hogan was going to be a hero who stood up for justice. I feel like we've heard a similar statement in recent years about John Cena, Wade. I mean, do you think that, we saw what happened. It was even compared in the documentary. Shoemaker said that trash they were throwing at Hulk Hogan at Bash of the Beach might as well have been gold bricks. And even Bruce Pritchard went on record as saying, hey, when Hulk turned to a bad guy, shit changed. That's the exact response that Bruce had. And it wasn't even really considered by Vince. And we've heard more recently, turning Cena was never really considered. Do you think with the benefit of hindsight, what they didn't do with Hogan, they should have done with Cena? Or do you think they made the right call?
Is that to me, Conrad?
Yeah. Wait,
yeah. We'll never know. There's a lot of forks in the road. I wish we could live parallel universes and see what happened. Cena's done well for himself, transitioning from WWF or WWE in ways that I don't think people anticipated. He found kind of a niche of all these other projects to do. Had he gone heel, maybe some people would have been like, well, I saw you the last couple of years. You don't seem like a guy that, people are going to want to ironically laugh at in a self-deprecating superhero type movie. Or, whatever the stuff that he's managed to do. It's worked out well for him, but there would have been a risk. But from a wrestling standpoint, if they had turned Cena a few years earlier at about the time that is sort of parallel to Hogan, I think it would have been a boom period. I think there would have been a real surge in interest. I think there was a generation of kids, like with Hogan, who grew up cheering him, who wanted a grown-up version of Cena that had some edge. And like Hogan, early in his career, he played heel. Cena played heel early on, and there was a kind of it's weird to say, but kind of a street cred, edginess, cool factor to Cena when he was playing heel, and I think that was still in him, and I think it would have worked. And I feel like wrestling fans were a little cheated not getting to see him show that side of what he did. But I don't think it was as urgently needed as it was for Hulk Hogan. I think Cena was in a better spot to ride it out because the kids and the women are cheering. And, I say that sort of intangible, you can't quantify it. The face of the brand being friendly and palatable and such a contrast to what people thought of pro wrestling, I think was a value that I think Vince McMahon was hesitant to give up too.
One of the fun things we like to do on the show every now and again, Eric, is say, what if? And next up, they talk about the idea that he's going to be facing off with Eric Bischoff. And they even say and show a clip of your audition from June of 1990, where you tried to get a gig with WWE. And the interviewer asked, maybe tongue-in-cheek, do you regret not hiring him? And Vince said, no, I don't regret anything in my whole life, which I'm sure made every therapist in the world sort of roll their eyes like, wow, nothing. But it is fun to think about. If you had gone to the WWF in 1990, so much of wrestling history changes, like in a weird way. We should all thank Vince McMahon for not hiring you in 1990, shouldn't we?
I do. For sure.
Yeah.
Like, I really needed that job when I was auditioning. I really needed that job.
You weren't living off the Velcro ninja stars?
No, I was not living. That got me in the door, but that went away fast.
I don't mean to make fun of them. That was like entrepreneurial and cool, but obviously that was not a life.
No, we barely broke even on that enterprise, but I did get a good gig out of it.
Yeah.
But no, it would have never worked. Honestly, this sounds so stupid, but I'm just not an East Coast guy. I could never get comfortable living on the East Coast, and ultimately it would have never worked out. But I would have probably never ended up in WCW either. Certainly not with the timing I did.
Vince sort of dismisses all of your success in WCW when he said something along the lines of everything they basically did was a WWF creation to begin with. And then we see a cutaway of Hall and Nash, who had been in WCW before the WWF, Randy Savage, who did some things in Memphis, Hulk Hogan, who had quite a run in the AWA, and Ted DiBiase from Mid-South, but we've already addressed the hypocrisy. Okay, sure, they're all WWF creations. But then we see Vince sort of beat himself up about that contract he gave Bret. He even calls himself a dumbass for thinking that he just had to have Bret. And he's sort of in his internal dialogue saying, no, I didn't, just go make new stars. But that's easier said than done. I mean, there was a long period there where we were struggling to make new stars. And even in more recent years, we've heard on the podcast before, Wade, Bruce say something like people around Vince would say, Vince is just looking for a hit. Vince just needs a hit. With the benefit of hindsight, had Bret gone to WCW in 1996, does anything really change with the WWF? Because we know ultimately what leads to the boom is the Mr. McMahon character, which is largely born out of Montreal, but Montreal wouldn't have happened if Bret would have went to WCW in 96. Do you think that we still would have had an attitude peak had Bret gone to WCW in 96?
I can't rule it out, but I don't think so. I mean, that opened up a main event spot for Steve Austin, and it created the Mr. McMahon heel character. I mean, he practiced it in Memphis as sort of on a whim once off national TV, and probably something he had an itch to do. But Bret leaving was the best thing that happened to Vince McMahon coming out, to come out of and survive the Monday Night Wars. I mean, I don't think it begat Vince McMahon. It begat Stone Cold Steve Austin. And then that spawned a lot of other things, that played off of that. And I will say I know I wrote that I thought Bret Hart jumping to WCW might be the death knell of the WWF at the time. It just felt like one star too many. That would be a tipping point. And there were so many dream matches for Bret Hart in WCW. And so so it didn't work out that way, but it's not, for people that live through it in real time, like, it's not absurd when people say, when you think about Vince McMahon's mindset, it was my mindset too. Losing Bret might be that tipping point. He was so the heart and soul of the WWF. And it's almost like taking that last, even more than Shawn Michaels, because they kind of got Shawn with Hall and Nash in terms of that faction. Bret leaving felt like tearing the heart out of the last thing that WWF stood for. The key is once he did really leave, it stood for something completely different. Vince McMahon, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and it paved the way for a big comeback.
God, I never looked at it that way from that perspective, but you're absolutely right. And these what if scenarios are really fun because they force you to look at things from a different angle and a different perspective, and it changes everything.
Yeah.
And just here talking about it, you think of how many things could have possibly changed for the better, for the worse in any scenario like this. It's really fun exercise.
I agree.
Shawn and Bret are sort of shooting on each other and pulling each other's hair out, literally, and even risking each other's marriages. Vince's response is, well, it made for good TV. And then as it all comes to a head, Hunter basically takes credit for the screw job, saying he suggested it on a phone call one night with Shawn and Vince. And Shawn is pretty emotional in saying that, he was troubled and he was going through a tough time, and Vince always had his back, and he felt like he owed some loyalty to Vince, and he did it. And I felt that was very genuine and honest, and you could see Bret was still very emotional in discussing Montreal. What is sort of shocking with the benefit of hindsight is to take a look at the footage that some of us saw around Wrestling with Shadows, where we see both Shawn and Hunter tell Bret and then Bret's wife Julie separately, I swear to God, I didn't know anything about it. It's kind of a tough watch with the benefit of hindsight. Wade, you covered this extensively. It's what made me a Torch subscriber. When you sort of see all this revisited, but now from Vince's eyes, and he says to this day he doesn't regret any of it. What do you make of Vince's retelling of the Montreal Screwjob?
My ultimate take on the Montreal Screwjob sided to the frustration of some of my colleagues on Vince's side. And I don't think it gets talked about enough, but because I know Bret felt betrayed, and I get that, and I don't want to discount that. Bret took himself, his career, gets made fun of, but it's genuine, being a Canadian national hero, as he says unironically, with, a lack of sometimes self-awareness, how it comes across. That's how he genuinely felt. Like, that's not fake. And he did feel betrayed by Vince, but Bret had reasonable creative control, in his contract. And he talked about that in an AOL chat. Like, it wasn't, and he made his case in an AOL chat afterwards. I think it was reasonable to request this. Like, it wasn't open and shut that Vince, like, it just, what is reasonable? Well, reasonable is telling Bret Hart, as Vince said when it came to Wendy Richter, it's a title I created. It's my title. I loan it to you. I grant you permission to carry it to the ring. But I get to decide when you lose it. And Bret didn't want to lose in Canada to Shawn Michaels. There was plenty of time to work out other options, and it didn't happen. But in the end, it came down to Vince. It came down to who had more power. And Vince had more power. If Bret had more power, he would have, quote, screwed Vince. I think Vince felt Bret was screwing him by not letting him have a title change. I think he just eye-rolled the whole Canada thing. Bret and Shawn were changing in the same locker room. It's not like they needed security to keep them apart. It's not that big of a deal. And in the end, what happened? Vince did the Bret Hart Canadian hero character a favor, which Bret Hart fans who are vociferously on his side are going to be mad at. Bret never lost the title. He got screwed out of it. He didn't have to lose at a house show. He didn't have to lose on Raw. He didn't have to lose in America. He didn't lose.
He's a sympathetic baby face. The heel screwed him.
Like, Vince McMahon, Bret would not have agreed to it. But Vince gave Bret Hart's character an escape hatch from losing to Shawn Michaels, because nobody thinks Bret lost that match. Everybody knows he was screwed. So Bret didn't get screwed. he got, of course he got screwed storyline wise, but he got the gift of not actually having to lose. And there's people who are going to be really mad at me for framing it that way, who feel strong. But I look at that and go, there's no Bret Hart fan who said, I think less of Bret Hart because he lost to Shawn Michaels in Canada. Nobody thought that. Everybody thought Bret Hart got screwed. It was even better for him than him not losing it and just handing over the title and relinquishing it, which obviously Vince didn't want in the lineage of the title. So, it's a complicated story. I reread some of my stuff today that I wrote at the time. It's in the back issues of People Go VIP in the 1997 section. And it's fascinating. But my editorial the week after is, that in a battle of, it came down to a battle of egos and power. And it just turned out, technically, Vince had a little bit more power than Bret, but I don't think there was, a clear-cut bad guy, good guy. It's just an awkward situation that both sides should have handled better. But, in the end, it still was Vince's call. Reasonable people can disagree on that because of the reasonable creative control clause that was there. But I don't know. Yeah, I think
I'm not an attorney, but yeah. I've had to fight the reasonable creative control conversation yes. and language in a contract a lot. Reasonable creative control is, sure, kid, I'll listen to what you have to say, and then I'm going to do what I want to do anyway, and there's nothing legally you're going to do about it.
Yeah.
That's what reasonable creative control is. Let me know your thoughts on this, and if I agree, I'll go with it. If I don't, I won't. That's it. That's reasonable creative control.
Yep. I've been saying this forever, because a week after the Montreal Screwjob, my headline in my editorial in the Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter number 467 was Vince McMahon devious but more dignified than Bret.
Yeah.
And because I don't think Bret going and punching Vince was dignified. I'm not like, oh, that was crossing a line and how dare him. In a way it was, but I'm not like, I understand it's wrestling and people have different versions of, whether Vince has made himself a martyr and a hero for going in the locker room. And I'll never know for sure whether he says, I'm going to let Bret punch me or not. No one will ever know. But
so here's what I got a problem with, Wade. Now, you studied martial arts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You got your black belt, right?
Yep.
All right. So I'm listening to Bret, and Bret says, I hit him right in the temple. Had to be a hook, right? You can't hit somebody in the temple unless you hit him with a hook.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed?
Yeah.
Yeah. Simple.
Well, unless you've got him.
Let me finish.
Well, okay. Yeah.
No, Bret said it was an uppercut. Somebody said
called it an uppercut. Bret called it an uppercut, and he said they were tied up. Now, Vince says he came in with a... I don't recall. But, he's got a shiner on his eye. He got hit in the eye. That's clear.
Yep.
And Bret said it was an uppercut.
Bret said it was an uppercut. Vince said he had his hands down. Bret said we locked up like they were going to wrestle first. And then Bret came from underneath and lifted him off the ground like it was Mike Tyson's Punch Out. He flew across the room like Uncle Phil used to throw DJ Jazzy Jeff out the front door.
Ain't buying it.
And he hurt his ankle when he fell.
I ain't buying it. Now, maybe you could give somebody a black eye if Vince's head was down between
Yes.
his, frankly, where it should have
Yeah,
been. So
that's
if
what I
his
was
head
going to
here,
say. Yeah.
okay, yeah, I can buy the uppercut. But somewhere, I'm going to have to go back and watch it. I thought it was Vince or somebody said he got hit right in the temple. So he either got hit in the temple, he got hit in the eye, or maybe he got hit in the eye with an uppercut. But that whole scenario, the way it was described, doesn't make sense to me.
My reporting at the time, I obviously wasn't in the room, but I talked to people who were. And my story that week, just in terms of a time capsule moment, was Bret approached Vince. More heated words were exchanged. He shoved McMahon. They wrestled for a second or two, which matches the documentary account. And then Bret landed a punch to McMahon's jaw and a punch to one of his eyes. And McMahon went down quickly. Was it one punch that maybe hit both because he was bent over or something? I mean, I don't know. So again, we're talking to people. It was a big scuffle. A lot happened. But the idea that he had his eye and his jaw were both talked about. And I guess that. But in terms of the uppercut, I know other people are noting that oh, I had never heard it was an uppercut before. But if he had like Vince, it sounded like they were grappling, basically standing up.
Yes.
So it's possible Vince's head was kind of twisted and down, and he just, hit his jaw and grazed his gave him the black eye too. So yeah, I don't know.
The reason I brought that up is the way you guys were describing the what if scenario and Wade talking about the fact that Vince actually did Bret a big favor and made him a sympathetic babyface. It's taking me back to, was this thing really a work? Are they still working?
You know what's funny you say that? The Blue Meanie, the real life Blue Meanie, is with us here live, and he actually just said that in the live chat. I'll try to see if I can find it. I think Dave Silva's asleep at the wheel, but if he's still with us, Brian Heffron is with us, and he's got some sort of point about that. It'll show up on the screen or it won't. There it is. The fact that everyone benefits from the screw job leads to the conspiracy. It was all a work. And I have never really been a believer of that until you work backwards. So this is what the conspiracy theorists say. Oh, well, everybody was better for it. We created the Mr. McMahon character. Bret got all this money from WCW and an easier schedule. Yeah. But the thing that has always stood out to me is the sort of false bravado and fake machismo for Vince McMahon. Oh, I owed him one shot. I was going to give him one shot. And he even repeats the line in this documentary. I came in with my hands down by my side. And Bret's like, no, that's not what happened. We wrestled. Just like you laid out in your original report, they grappled. That's where the punch comes from. I know it was Vince who said in the documentary that it was in the temple. I think Bret has always maintained that he hit him in the eye. I mean, we saw the bruising on the eye. But the idea that Vince came in and felt like he owed Bret a shot, that just seems make-believe and revisionist to me, Wade.
So if you'll indulge, I'll read a few sentences I wrote the week this happened
Please
about the conspiracy theory, because I address this in the back page of the newsletter. I said, the only problem with the it's all a work theory is it isn't to anyone's advantage to work everyone. This goes against what Brian was saying. McMahon is taking tremendous heat in the locker room from wrestlers and other employees. McMahon has become the ultimate heel in Canada, which might hurt business. He didn't know he's going to become a transformational heel character at this point. The WWE title has lost prestige because it appears the WWF stole the title from Bret and gave it to Michaels on a silver platter. Why would McMahon agree to give Bret an excuse to say when he arrives in WCW that he never lost the WWF title? The only advantage to McMahon was a one-time boost in ratings for Raw based on the buzz after the incident, but there would have been a huge turnout anyway because Bret's announcement would have been made on Nitro no matter what. And I said if Bret was willing to lose the title clean to someone else or to Michaels in another city, why go through the elaborate plot just to fool people? It doesn't make any sense. So anyway, that's again, this is my take at the time. I've never bought into the conspiracy theory, and I just think to know Bret is to realize, like, he's just absolutely quintessential Bret in all this. Like, if this was a work, I just think Bret would have this little sly smile as he talks, because he does. He has that as part of his facial expressions, and he doesn't. He's like, and everybody else around Bret would have had to been worked too. Bret would not have kept this up this long, and it just everything makes sense. It's Vince wasn't thinking when he did it, nor obviously was Bret, that this gives Bret an escape hatch from ever having to lose the title. This was just Vince in a power play with Bret. It was a battle of egos and will, and everyone worked for Vince, so Vince got his way. That's what happened. Ultimately he had more power. But I don't, with all due respect, I mean, it's fun to talk about, but I've never given much credence to it, other than I wrote an editorial.
You bring up a good point, Wade, in that Vince didn't know that night that he was going to become, as you put it, a quintessential heel and a transformative heel.
Yeah.
He didn't know that. That happened as a result, but you don't plan that.
Yeah.
If you do, you're really, 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 really good and have a crystal ball or two.
Yeah. And that, I mean, this was a multi-week story, and I was reporting out every week. This was a real battle of wills, and there were other solutions that were offered, and then they missed the windows to do it. And another thing that doesn't get talked about in this is Bret in 1992 had considered going to WCW and not dropping the Intercontinental title. I mean, it takes, if we're going to call out Vince for being a hypocrite, we're going to call out Bret for it. I mean, again, he might have, I floated the idea, but would never do it. I don't know the full context, but like the idea of this happening and, isn't, I don't know. It's just the lead up to it, everything that led up to it and the personalities involved just point towards this was a battle of two people who were really close, didn't want, and they each had their heels dug into the ground. Everything leading up to this said this is leading to a culmination that's going to, cause some fireworks if they don't get on the same page. And nobody I talked to was actually really close to the situation in real time around these people thinks this was anything but the culmination of a battle of wills, and Vince won.
Well, I think we all won today.
Yeah, Bret's pride was hurt.
We all won today.
Yeah.
I don't mean to cut you off there, Wade, but I just wanted to say I feel like we all won today. It was so awesome to have you join us here today and break down episode 3. This is an episode that a lot of people probably thought would never happen, including Eric Bischoff himself. But, man, I want to recommend again, if you're listening and you enjoy what we do in 83 weeks, where we take a deep dive in the history of professional wrestling, you will nerd out and have the time of your life on the Torch website. Nobody's been covering at such a high level for as long in such an easy to peruse document and all of the incredible value inside. The Torch Talk was really innovative. Long before there were podcasts or there were shoot interviews, people would pick up the phone and talk to Wade, and you get to go relive all of that right now for $1 when you use our promo code.
I might change my mind.
Wade, tell everybody how they can keep up with all your stuff and check out the archives and take a look under the hood. I promise people will love it if they just get a chance to take a look.
So 3 main things. We have a website. I report stuff every day on it. Live TV coverage, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, pay-per-view coverage, pwtorch.com. So make that part of your bookmarks and open a tab. Number 2, we do free podcasts throughout the week. I do a live show on YouTube after Raw, Dynamite, and SmackDown, and that's on our PW Torch YouTube channel. We also put that out as a podcast, and then also the weekly flagship with different guest co-hosts, and we talk broad topics, all the big topics, just kind of like I did here, but with different personalities and co-hosts. Search Wade Keller and subscribe to that. That's free. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, everywhere. And then the third one is the membership with the 35 plus years of archives, ad-free website, compatible with Apple Podcasts, by the way. We have a super custom built thing where you just click a link in your email and it just signs you up on Apple Podcasts. No advanced settings, no passwords or anything. It's super frictionless. And with a coupon code Conrad24, we'll knock off we'll discount it to $1 for a month. So you can try what we do. If you're an old subscriber, come on back for $1. And if you're brand new, we welcome you. And comes with a lot of perks, including Wade Keller hotlines. I'm reviewing each session of this. I did an hour yesterday on episode 2 of the Netflix series. I'm going to keep doing long solo updates, just walking through everything that happened with my take on it. There's the Fix with Todd Martin, everything with Rich and Wade. There's a lot of great regular weekly shows too that are VIP exclusive. So pwtorch.com/govip, and then just enter coupon code Conrad24 and we'll charge you $1 for a full month of access.
So you know what, Wade? You know what I'm going to do? Conrad, you're not going to believe this. For the first time in my life,
I'm going to
subscribe. I've never subscribed to a newsletter.
Oh, wow.
I am going to subscribe, and I'm not going to do it just for a month. I'm going to do a full year. So
wow.
We'll get right down to it. So yeah.
That's awesome. Well, people can apply the discount to a 1-year sub. You don't get the whole year for $1, but whatever the discount's going to be, $11. Well, you can apply that to a year sub too, Eric. So we don't want to charge you full price. I appreciate it. That's very kind. Yeah, no, we have a back issue section. It's in the menu on our webpage, year by year. Everything, just you can go back to 1997, 1996 and read all the stuff I've been quoting here. And like Conrad said, it's a nice layout. We've been through a lot of technologies over the years and updated the website over the years, and there's different formats, but it's all there laid out issue by issue, year by year.
Well, and listen, I just want to give you some props. It's not only that you reported all this stuff, but the way you've archived it and you've made it so easy to access. There were clips throughout this documentary that showed your newsletter. They've never done a Dark Side of the Ring without showing your headlines. Like, I know there's another name that gets thrown around, and he's mine and your friend, and maybe not everybody on this call's friend, but want to give a shout out to you for being the other guy behind the guy, because the torch, man, when I was growing up, that's what everybody was talking about, the torch. And we got the guy here with us today. You can go enjoy 35 years worth of archives for $1. Use that promo code Conrad24. Mr. Wade Keller, thank you so much for all the time today.
Conrad, thank you. Class act. I appreciate the kind words. Eric, you know you and I get along better than we pretend. The last
we do. And by the way, I'm going to be in Minneapolis the first week in October. I'm going to reach out to you and
please do
buy you a steak. How's that?
Well, I'm vegan, but we can find something to eat.
I'll buy you a fake steak burger.
I enjoy
something.
Awesome. I appreciate it, Eric. Let's make that happen.
Yeah, we'll get together for sure.
I'd love that.
Thanks a lot, Wade. We appreciate you jumping on with us. We know you guys asked a lot of questions. Eric and I are going to try to get to those as much as we can here. I want to first give a shout out to John Thompson. Man, you're like an OG, a foundational member here at what we're doing at 83weeks.com. Greatly appreciate that. Eric, he's got a question for you. How did you feel when Hulk Hogan turned heel as a fan, jumped across the barricades and tried to attack him? Would you have joined the NWO then to send a message that you're part of a new faction, or would you have done nothing? So if you found yourself in the ring and now a fan's jumping in, are you going to try to defend Hulk Hogan? Or, I mean, from a character standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. Like, are we going to say that we're with the bad guys and these invaders and protect them? That's something I never even really considered until reading this question.
I'm not sure I understand the scenario again. So I'm
okay. All right, so you're Bash at the Beach 1996. Hulk Hogan's just turned. He's with the two outsiders. A WCW fan is trying to slide in to save the day because he's pissed off at Hulk Hogan for turning. You're in the ring. You're Mr. WCW. Would you have attacked the fan?
No, I'd have helped him.
That's that. Like, if you're trying to keep kayfabe, it's a weird thing. Like, we don't know if this weirdo's got a knife on him or what. But
no, I
can't spill the beans in front of everybody.
I would have tried to protect him.
Yes. You got to do what you can. John's got another question. It's episode 3 and no interviews yet with good old JR and the swerve man, Vince Russo. Are you surprised that Russo, Nick Khan, George Barrios, Michelle, Johnny Ace, Jim Ross, none of these folks were interviewed? Is that a surprise to you? Jerry McDivitt's not interviewed.
That one surprised me. That one did surprise me. And they may have tried to get to Jerry, but by the time that happened, no, that would have been too late in the series. So I was surprised that Jerry wasn't there. A little surprised that JR wasn't there because JR had a front row seat to all of the essence of what we're talking about, right? JR was right there, real close to that. So JR's perspective would have been a good one to have. So yes, surprise, but given JR's relationship with AEW, that could have been a factor too. Who else? Russo, Russo was a blip. He was a minute, cup of coffee, didn't really have any impact other than he was there. And he doesn't have a lot of credibility. I would have liked to have heard from Jim Cornette. I think Cornette would have been a more interesting perspective to hear than Russo for sure, and was surprised that they didn't get Cornette. Now, maybe Cornette just doesn't like doing this kind of thing. I don't know.
Well, of course he likes doing this sort of thing. He does Dark Side. He does every episode.
No, I know, but I mean, talking about Vince, he may not be comfortable talking about Vince.
Well, the thing that was weird to me is when we hear from Tony Atlas more than all those names I just rattled off, I feel like, no disrespect to Tony Atlas, but you've got all these people who worked in the office who were on the inner circle. And respectfully, Tony Atlas was not one of those guys. And so when we start to have those type interviews, as opposed to some of those names we just rattled off, it made me feel like, well, are they leaning the dark side of the ring route because they're trying to tap into the emotions of the performers? And maybe he was just supposed to be the voice of the performers, and maybe they felt like they needed some representation, and they needed
part of Conrad is he's really good.
Yeah,
I mean, he's entertaining to listen to and look at. He's he's good on camera. He's good at that type of thing. And that probably had as much to do with why we saw so much of him as we did. There's a lot of people you can spend 4 hours talking to him and you get about 2.5 minutes worth of material you might be able to use. Tony's one of those guys, probably because he's done a million of these types of interviews talking about Vince in one way, shape, or form, to a shoot interview somewhere, or just next to some dude in the bar. I don't know. But he's entertaining as hell. I enjoyed listening to him. And in terms of the way he presented everything.
I want to be clear. I loved it too. I love that he's plain speak, and I appreciate his approach to life and storytelling. But if I'm really trying to do a deep dive on Vince McMahon, I think I'd rather hear from the head of talent relations than, respectfully, one of the talent.
Yep.
I want to give a shout out to Topper Harley, who's joining the club here at 83weeks.com, throwing you a little too sweet action. Thanks for signing up. Appreciate you too, TJ Godfrey, for signing up. And how about our buddy Travis Medway? He gifted 5 memberships here at 83weeks.com. Thank you very much. By the way, if you guys haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications bell. We're going to be back here tomorrow for episode 4 at 5 p.m. Eastern. We'll be back on Sunday at 5 p.m. Eastern, breaking down episode 5, and then we'll be back on Monday, putting a button.
And
on
I'm going to try to get us a special guest on Monday to kind of wrap things up.
Okay, how about that?
Can't promise, but I'm going to try.
Travis Medway says, it's been said the increasingly apathetic reactions to the red and yellow Hogan contributed to him being convinced to turning heel, but that reaction at Bash at the Beach to his arrival was thunderous. He must have been thinking, oh, fuck. I've never really thought about that, but he's committed. He spent the night at Kevin Sullivan's house. He's decided he's going to do it. He's walking out to be the third man. He's going to turn heel, but they give him a big pop. It gets a big reaction. He gets the hero's welcome. I'm wondering, is that one of the longest walks of his life as he's walking down the ramp, like second guessing himself? Oh shit, did I do it? Is this right call? Is this the... I could totally see him second guessing that, Eric. I never even thought of that till right
Neither
here.
did I, and it's a great, great thought. And next time I talk to Hulk, which might be as soon as we're done here, I'm going to ask him, because that's a great question. Great question, Travis. Thank you. And you know what? I will ask him. I don't know how long it's going to take me to get on the phone with him. I think he's got a little bit of a flooding problem right now down in Clearwater. I saw pictures of Hogan's beach shop, and it's like water halfway up to the ceiling. So I'm not going to probably bother him with this right now, but within the next week or so, I'll give him a shot. I'm going to get the answer to that, and we'll cover it right here on Wise Choices.
John Thompson III wants to know, would you have taken the belt off Wendy Richter, or would you have given her a push if you were in charge of WWE? So Wendy Richter, we sort of laid that out at the very beginning of the episode. I don't think you and I have ever had a conversation like this, but we saw Vince do a screw job on 2 occasions, once to Wendy Richter, once to Bret. Would you have ever considered doing a screw job, or would you have just done something else?
I understand why someone would do the screw job. I mean, let me put it this way. I agree more than I disagree with Vince's position of that's his belt. You get to play with it, but I own it. And I decide when I'm going to take it back or not. I firmly believe in that without any question. Now, I like to think, and I'm probably wrong, but I would like to think that I would never put myself in a position where I would have to screw somebody, because I would probably just take the bullet and resolve the issue, fire the talent, take the belt, and deal with the repercussions later. I don't like fucking around with stuff like that. And I also don't like being threatened or held up. I there's only a couple things that get me to really overreact. And it would be a threat or an ultimatum. And either one would not have worked. I probably would have never gotten to the point of a screw job. I would have rather just said, fine, you're fucking fired. You're done. You'll never see a TV camera in this company again. Now give me my belt. Go with God. And of course, I'd be stuck with the repercussions of that. But that's most likely what I would do by choice. If I had to, I'd screw somebody like that in a minute, because they're screwing me. That's not screwing somebody. That's counter screwing them. When somebody holds you up and says, either do this or I'm not going to go along with it, or either do it my way or the highway, all bets are off. That's the first punch, and I'll counter punch. But again, I would have preferred to have just taken my lumps and gotten it over with in the beginning and deal with the repercussions, as opposed to having to go through the artful machinations of trying to figure out how to get a belt off somebody.
AOTV Productions says, hey, Eric, Lanny Poffo said Randy hated the Nacho Man and Huckster bit, especially when they made fun of his bald spot. Did you ever talk to Randy about that?
Not specifically about the bald spot, but Randy was not a fan. Hulk didn't really care. I think he was kind of, that's funny. That's Vince. No big deal. Randy did take it a little, he was a little hotter, but Randy was wound a little tighter. Hulk is about one of the most chill dudes you'll ever be around. I mean, he's really chill most of the time. Randy was the exact opposite. He was rarely chill, and most of the time he was pretty intense, and a little self-conscious.
Paranoid.
Yeah, about the hair. He's
Yeah.
a little self-conscious about that.
JM is with us, and he wants to let us know that Rick Rude is in the WWE Hall of Fame. Yes, he is. He went in 2017, about 18 years after he died. I asked why he didn't go in before and wondered, were there some hard feelings about that testimony? But yes, he is in the Hall of Fame, and he went in posthumously nearly 20 years after he died. John wants to know, what if question, if Bret didn't take the contract Vince gave him in 96 and joined WCW, what would your plans have been for him? I mean, I think the natural thing from the outside looking in, Eric, is that happened in, I believe, October of 96. The NWO was still in its early stages, its formative stages. It feels as if you're trying to represent outsiders, well, if we got the old 1-2-3 Kid, and the old $1 Million Man, and the old Hulk Hogan, and the old Diesel, and the old Razor Ramon, would the Hitman have joined the NWO? Was that the plan?
Well, there wasn't a plan. And I don't think that would have been it. I think because look, while I wanted to build the NWO, they also had to have an opponent. So it was kind of simultaneously. Yes. I know I wanted it to be lopsided, and it was for a long time, but that's called a comeback. That's what happens in a wrestling match. And that's what I wanted originally to happen with the NWO WCW storyline. So likely, I mean, who knows what I would have done in that moment, but my gut tells me I would have brought him in to help Ric Flair and some of the more established traditional type of talent, because that's at least in my mind who Bret represents, mostly because of his style of wrestling. So I think I would have brought him in on the WCW side against the NWO.
Arden Jr. says Bret was the CM Punk of his era, super egotistical. I don't know about that. David says, Eric, if Vince called you during the 83 weeks and was serious about a co-branded show, super pay-per-view, what would you have said? Would that have been something you would have done? A WWF, WCW joint venture on pay-per-view when WCW was in the lead? Call it 97?
Probably.
Oh, man. Wow. That's something to think about there. That's like a Bill Apter magazine fan dream right there. I mean, that was what all the magazines had as their cover.
That would have been business, though. That would have been looking into the future.
Yeah.
And look, this is really fantasy booking bullshit, but my ego would have been whatever personal investment there was, and there was, trust me, I would have been very satisfied to get that phone call. And the minute I got that phone call, it would have been all about what the future could look like under that scenario. And there's no way I could look at that picture and not try to achieve it. So yeah, I would have. And by the way, Harvey Schiller, I believe, took a meeting with Vince. Now, this is before NWO and all that. After Nitro, though, but before NWO. So sometime in 95, I believe that Harvey Schiller and Vince and maybe somebody else from WWE had a meeting about trying to do something jointly. And it was Vince who basically turned it down. So especially knowing that, and I did know that, Harvey did tell me after the fact, but knowing that that's what Harvey would have wanted to do, I would have absolutely had to have brought that to Harvey. And then it probably would have been a decision that would have I wouldn't have been the only one making that decision. Let's put it. I would have had a pretty loud voice, and maybe the loudest voice, but there would have been a conversation at levels higher than me, probably including Ted.
Mario has a question that I'm wondering is maybe a little tongue in cheek. He says, "Was it true that Eric used his kickboxing rep within WCW to executives and to intimidate people into doing things his way?" So were you? 'Cause listen, we've all heard these silly narratives that maybe you had lost your front teeth in a fight and you wore a bridge and you'd take it out and you'd put on a Viking helmet. And there's all this silly imagery through the years. Where does this come from? Did people just casually find out you used to do kickboxing on TV and then come up with all these hokey stories?
I mean, I don't. It wasn't a secret that I had been involved in martial arts, but it also wasn't something that I talked about too often, just like I don't now. I mean, I'll bring it up if it's in the context of a conversation that's already going on, if that helps bring context to the conversation. But honestly, I don't think about it much, and I certainly didn't. Look, anybody who tries to tell you I tried to intimidate anybody in WCW or bully my way around or intimidate people wasn't there or is lying through their teeth. Especially wrestling talent. I knew better. And that now I did do some pretty silly shit at Christmas parties every once in a while. I mean, the first time I ever took my teeth out was at a Dusty Rhodes Christmas party shortly after I got to WCW, and we were all drinking and having a good time, and had Willie Nelson playing on the stereo. And I don't know how the scenario turned out or what led up to it, but I had a partial plate because I did get my teeth knocked out, and I had a partial plate. I could flip them out really fast. I got good at it, and I took my teeth out, I put them up on Dusty's mantle. Dusty's looking at me, and I'm smiling at him like this, and I go, and when I smiled again, my hand moved that fast, my teeth were gone. But that was when after I took my teeth out, I did that. Then I put them up on the bar and went around Dusty's Christmas party toothless for the rest of the night. So I did some silly shit like that, but I never tried to intimidate anybody or bull anybody or any of that kind of stuff.
John Thompson is with us, and he wanted to point out some of his favorite quotes from this episode. Number one, "Yeah, swear to God all you want, but someday God's going to strike you down." Julie Hart said that to Triple H. Number two, "You're going to have to learn to eat shit and like the taste of it." Vince McMahon said that to Triple H. And what I say a lot of times is totally different than what I think. And boy, the idea that Vince McMahon just looked right in the camera and said that made me laugh out loud. Thanks for the mega donation here today, John Thompson. Greatly appreciate that. And thank you for joining us. By the way, everybody, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications bell. We're going to be back here tomorrow live for episode 4. And there's several more questions. We'll get to all we can here today. Nate says, "I thought when they talked about Randy going to WCW at some point, the rumor about him and Stephanie would be brought up. I guess we'll never know. Of all the things I thought would be discussed on this, that was never one of them." What say you, Eric?
No, I would have been disappointed if that came up. That's silly. I mean, it's not silly to ask the question. I know it's rumor, it's innuendo, it's because some of that low-hanging dirt fruit that everybody likes to pick, but it's there's no place in this documentary. No place for it anywhere, really, but especially in this documentary.
We greatly appreciate Wade joining us today. Eric, I know that, yesterday we were having a group chat and we were sort of freestyling. Hey, we had a great interview with Pat LaPrade here. He flushed out a lot of details about Pat Patterson and Andre that were critical for episode 2. And I was trying to think through, hey, man, who covered the steroid trial and the screw job? And we went through a few names and we landed on Wade. And I forwarded you an email before we clicked record, but I'll admit I did maybe forget accidentally, not on purpose at all, to mention that it would be Wade. And I could tell from your reaction right before we went live where you go, "Wade, I didn't know you would be joining us today." I felt my heart go in my throat. Oh, yeah, I talked to Derek about this, and I talked to Ian about this, and I talked to Silva about this. I didn't talk to Eric about this, but Eric, Wade was great. That was awesome.
Honestly, I can't wait to do something like this again down the road. He's really, really good. He's articulate,
Yes.
he knows his shit, he's detailed, and he's a great storyteller on top of it. So he's great at what he does. And I'm really grateful that you did it. And I'm glad that I was surprised by it because that just makes it more fun, to be honest. And I can't wait to do something with him again.
I can't wait because now I can really stretch. Tune
I'm
in
so excited.
tomorrow. Even Eric doesn't know who's going to show up. 5 p.m. Eastern, 83weeks.com. And if you enjoyed what you heard from Roy today, and how could you not, go right now to pwtorch.com. Use that promo code Conrad24. You're going to get a month for $1. And I'm telling you, when you try it, you're going to love it. The old Torch Talks are great. The old hotlines are great. But being able to go through year by year and take a look at the newsletter, and this is not a knock at anybody, but it's formatted like a newsletter, and it's got the headlines. You've seen them on Dark Side of the Ring. You've seen them on this documentary. Go support Wade. Check out his stuff. It's a ton of archives, and it's $1 when you use that promo code Conrad24. Don't forget, hit the subscribe button, turn on the notifications bell. We'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern, breaking down all things Mr. McMahon on Netflix, episode 4, right here at 83weeks.com.